Welcome, thunder-blessed dreamers, to the mountain peaks where lightning splits the sky and courage hides within the hearts of those who tremble most. Tonight, we follow the complete journey of Agatsuma Zenitsu, a soul whose thunder roared loudest when fear threatened to silence him forever. This is a tale of cowardice that bloomed into heroism, of lightning that struck not from the heavens but from within, of a boy who learned that true strength flows not from fearlessness but from acting despite terror that would paralyze lesser spirits. So settle beneath your covers like storm clouds gathering before gentle rain, and let the distant rumble of thunder breathing carry you into peaceful slumber as we trace every lightning-struck step of Zenitsu's extraordinary path from trembling orphan to legendary demon slayer. In the sprawling tapestry of human suffering that characterized the final years of the Meiji era, where traditional values collided with rapid modernization and countless souls found themselves adrift in a world that seemed to change faster than hearts could adapt, there lived a boy whose very existence embodied the vulnerability and desperate hope that defined those caught between old certainties and uncertain futures. Agatsuma Zenitsu entered this world not through the warm embrace of loving parents or the security of family bonds that should have provided foundation for healthy development, but through circumstances that would forever mark his approach to relationships, trust, and the fundamental question of whether human beings could be relied upon to offer genuine care rather than calculated exploitation. The absence of parental guidance that characterized Zenitsu's earliest years created psychological wounds that ran deeper than simple material deprivation, as the lack of consistent adult protection and nurturing during critical developmental periods left him without the internal framework that most children acquire through stable family relationships. Without parents to model appropriate boundaries, healthy relationships, or basic self-respect, Zenitsu grew into adolescence with emotional needs so profound and unmet that they created desperate vulnerability to anyone who offered even the pretense of affection or acceptance, regardless of their true motivations or character. The orphaned existence that shaped his worldview was characterized not by dramatic tragedy that might have created clear narrative around loss and recovery, but by the grinding uncertainty and emotional neglect that left him constantly searching for validation and belonging, while lacking the tools necessary to distinguish between genuine care and sophisticated manipulation. The institutions, or temporary guardians, who presumably provided basic physical care during his childhood years, failed to address the deeper psychological needs that could only be met through consistent emotional investment from adults viewed his welfare as genuinely important rather than mere obligation or burden. This foundation of insecurity and abandonment created personality patterns that would follow Zenitsu throughout his journey toward Demon Slayer status, manifesting as desperate people-pleasing behaviors, inability to establish healthy boundaries in relationships, and tendency to mistake any form of attention for authentic love or friendship. The psychological hunger that resulted from early emotional deprivation made him easy prey for individuals whose own character flaws led them to seek victims who could be exploited without significant resistance or sophisticated understanding of their own worth and dignity. The girl who would ultimately become the catalyst for Zenitsu's transformation from vulnerable youth to Demon Slayer apprentice appeared in his life during precisely the developmental period when his need for romantic validation and adult acceptance had reached critical intensity. Yet his judgment and experience remained completely inadequate for recognizing predatory behavior disguised as romantic interest. She represented everything his damaged psyche craved: beauty, apparent interest in his welfare, and the promise of the family connection he had never experienced, but desperately needed to feel complete and worthy of existence. The courtship that developed between them followed patterns that would have been immediately recognizable to more experienced observers as exploitation rather than genuine romance. Yet Zenitsu's emotional starvation made him incapable of distinguishing between authentic affection and calculated manipulation designed to access his financial resources while providing minimal emotional investment in return. Her requests for money began subtly, framed as temporary needs or romantic gestures that demonstrated his devotion and commitment to their shared future. Each successful extraction establishing precedent for increasingly ambitious financial demands that gradually consumed his limited resources. The psychology of financial exploitation in romantic relationships operates through systematic erosion of victims' boundaries and self-preservation instincts, replacing healthy skepticism with emotional dependency that makes rational analysis of partners' behavior impossible until catastrophic consequences force recognition of the deception that has been occurring. Zenitsu's inexperience with genuine romantic relationships made him particularly susceptible to this manipulation, as he lacked reference points for distinguishing between normal relationship expenses and systematic financial abuse disguised as expressions of love and commitment to shared future. The escalation of her financial demands paralleled the deepening of his emotional investment in their relationship, creating psychological trap where questioning her motives would require acknowledging that his judgment had been completely wrong and that the love he believed they shared was entirely fabricated for exploitative purposes. This cognitive dissonance made it easier to rationalize increasingly unreasonable requests than to face the devastating truth that he had been selected as victim rather than partner, that his emotional needs had been weaponized against him by someone whose apparent caring was entirely performative. The debts that accumulated through this systematic exploitation grew beyond Zenitsu's ability to manage or repay through conventional means, creating financial crisis that threatened not only his economic survival, but his physical safety as creditors became increasingly aggressive in their collection efforts. The borrowed money that had seemed manageable when viewed through the lens of romantic optimism and belief in shared future transformed into crushing burden that made normal life impossible, while creating immediate danger from individuals whose patience with delinquent borrowers was limited by their own financial pressures and business imperatives. The moment when she revealed her true intentions by abandoning him for another man, taking with her whatever portable assets she could access while leaving him solely responsible for debts that had been incurred primarily for her benefit, represented psychological trauma that exceeded simple heartbreak to encompass fundamental challenge to his ability to trust his own perceptions and judgment about human nature. The discovery that someone he had loved completely and trusted absolutely had been systematically deceiving him created emotional devastation that would influence his approach to relationships for years to come, embedding deep-seated fear of vulnerability and abandonment that would manifest in his desperate need for constant reassurance and validation. The debt collectors who began pursuing Zenitsu after her departure represented a form of systematic intimidation and threat that transformed his daily existence into constant anxiety and fear. As individuals whose business model depended on extracting payment through psychological pressure and implied violence, made it clear that his financial obligations would be collected regardless of his emotional state or changed circumstances. Their methods of persuasion operated outside legal frameworks that might have provided protection for vulnerable debtors, relying instead on threats and harassment that made normal life impossible while creating ever-increasing pressure toward desperate measures that might provide quick financial relief. The isolation that accompanied his financial crisis was compounded by shame and embarrassment that made seeking help from potential allies nearly impossible, as admitting the extent of his financial problems would require explaining how completely he had been deceived by someone whose true character he had completely misjudged. The social stigma associated with being victimized by romantic fraud, particularly for young men who were expected to demonstrate wisdom and self-protection in such matters, created additional barrier to accessing support systems that might have provided alternative solutions to his desperate circumstances. The psychological state that characterized Zenitsu during this crisis period involved constant anxiety, hypervigilance regarding potential threats from creditors, and growing despair about his ability to resolve problems that seemed to expand faster than any possible solutions could address them. Sleep became elusive as worry consumed his thoughts during hours when rest should have provided escape from daily pressures, while waking hours were dominated by desperate calculations about possible sources of income or assistance that might prevent the violent consequences that creditors had made clear would follow continued inability to meet payment schedules. The physical symptoms that accompanied this prolonged stress included digestive problems from irregular eating patterns and constant anxiety, trembling hands that reflected nervous system strain, and general deterioration of health that resulted from prioritizing debt-related crisis management over basic self-care and nutrition. His appearance began reflecting internal turmoil through weight loss, poor grooming, and general physical presentation that suggested someone whose circumstances had progressed beyond manageable challenges toward genuine crisis that threatened survival itself. The social consequences of his financial situation included increasing isolation from peers whose normal concerns and activities seemed impossibly distant from his daily struggle with creditors and mounting pressure, while his desperate need for immediate financial relief made him vulnerable to additional exploitation from individuals who recognized his vulnerability and willingness to accept unfavorable terms for any assistance that might provide temporary respite from collection activities. The combination of financial pressure and social isolation created downward spiral that made recovery through conventional means increasingly unlikely with each passing day. The hopelessness that began characterizing Zenitsu's worldview during this period reflected not only immediate crisis, but fundamental challenge to his ability to envision future circumstances where happiness, security, or genuine human connection might be possible, given how completely his trust and judgment had been proven inadequate for navigating adult relationships and responsibilities. The betrayal he had experienced created psychological framework where expecting positive outcomes or trusting in others' good intentions seemed naive and dangerous, yet his desperate need for human connection made complete isolation equally unbearable. The desperation that drove his daily existence during this crisis period would prove to be both curse and unexpected blessing, as the complete absence of conventional options or safety nets would eventually make him receptive to opportunities that might otherwise have seemed too dangerous or uncertain to consider seriously. The elimination of normal paths towards security and happiness through the systematic destruction of his financial stability and emotional trust would create psychological conditions where radical alternatives could be embraced despite their obvious risks and uncertain outcomes. The salvation that would transform Zenitsu's desperate circumstances from impossible burden into the first step toward extraordinary destiny arrived not through conventional channels of social assistance or institutional intervention, but through the compassionate recognition of a man whose own life had been dedicated to understanding human potential and the mysterious ways that strength could emerge from apparent weakness. Jigoro Kuwajima approached the crisis that had consumed Zenitsu's existence with the calm authority of someone who had witnessed countless variations of human suffering and learned to distinguish between temporary setbacks that required simple assistance and fundamental character challenges that demanded complete transformation of perspective and capability. The former Thunder Hashira's decision to intervene in the financial disaster that threatened to destroy a young man he had never previously encountered reflected wisdom that transcended normal calculations of cost and benefit, operating according to principles that recognized potential where others saw only liability and perceived opportunity for meaningful development in circumstances that appeared to offer nothing but continued deterioration. His approach to Zenitsu's creditors demonstrated not only financial resources adequate for resolving immediate crisis, but understanding of human psychology that enabled him to transform what could have been simple debt payment into foundation for relationship that would reshape everything about how Zenitsu understood himself and his place in the Pace's world. The meeting that would change both their lives forever occurred during one of Zenitsu's darkest moments, when the accumulated pressure from debt collectors and complete absence of viable solutions had brought him to the edge of despair that made even survival seem questionable. Without intervention that appeared increasingly unlikely with each passing day, Jigoro's appearance in his life carried the quality of miraculous timing that suggested forces beyond simple coincidence were operating to bring together teacher and student whose destinies were intertwined in ways that neither could have anticipated or planned through conventional decision-making processes. The elderly swordsman's initial assessment of Zenitsu's character revealed perceptive abilities that enabled him to see past the obvious manifestations of crisis and desperation toward underlying qualities that might be developed into extraordinary capabilities given proper guidance and sufficient time for growth. Where others observed only a young man whose poor judgment and emotional weakness had created circumstances that justified contempt or dismissal, Jigoro recognized sensitivity, genuine compassion, and raw spiritual potential that could be cultivated into strengths that would serve not only individual development, but broader purposes that aligned with his lifetime commitment to protecting innocent people from supernatural threats they could neither perceive nor combat independently. The conversation that preceded Jigoro's offer of assistance provided the former Hashira with crucial insights into Zenitsu's psychological makeup and the factors that had contributed to his current predicament, revealing not character flaws that made him unsuitable for serious responsibility, but inexperience and unmet emotional needs that had created vulnerability to exploitation, while leaving intact the fundamental moral framework and capacity for growth that effective training could develop into genuine strength. His questions probed beyond surface details of financial crisis toward deeper understanding of motivations, fears, and dreams that would determine whether intensive instruction in dangerous arts would produce reliable ally in supernatural warfare or create additional problems that could threaten innocent lives. The decision to pay off Zenitsu's accumulated debts represented more than generous assistance or charitable impulse, constituting investment in potential that Jigoro's experienced assessment had identified despite its concealment beneath layers of anxiety, self-doubt, and emotional damage that had resulted from exploitation and abandonment. The substantial sum required to eliminate financial obligations that had seemed impossibly large from Zenitsu's perspective demonstrated not only material resources that came from successful Demon Slayer career, but commitment to educational project that would require years of patient instruction and could provide no guarantee of success despite considerable expenditure of time, energy, and financial support. The relief that flooded through Zenitsu as the immediate threat from creditors was permanently eliminated created psychological space for considering possibilities that had been impossible to contemplate, while survival itself remained uncertain and daily existence was consumed by crisis management. activities that left no energy for planning or hope about future circumstances. The removal of financial pressure allowed suppressed aspects of his personality to emerge from defensive hiding, revealing curiosity, humor, and genuine desire to contribute meaningfully to something larger than his own survival that had been obscured by the desperate self-focus that crisis situations inevitably create in vulnerable individuals. Jigoro's explanation of his intentions regarding Zenitsu's future development introduced concepts that seemed to exist in an entirely different realm from anything the young man's previous experience had prepared him to understand or evaluate. As discussion of demon slayers, supernatural threats, and ancient breathing techniques challenged fundamental assumptions about reality, while offering purpose and identity that transcended the limited horizons that had previously defined his ambitions and self-concept. The revelation that individuals could develop capabilities that exceeded normal human limitations through disciplined training and proper instruction provided framework for understanding how his current weakness and fear might be transformed into genuine strength rather than simply managed or concealed. The mountain training ground where Jigoro conducted his instruction represented physical environment that embodied principles central to his educational philosophy, as the isolation, natural beauty, and inherent challenges of mountain terrain provided optimal conditions for intensive development, while eliminating distractions and social pressures that might interfere with complete focus on learning ancient arts that demanded absolute dedication and sustained effort. The dojo that served as focal point for formal instruction had been constructed according to traditional principles that created atmosphere of reverence and serious purpose, appropriate for transmitting knowledge that could determine not only individual survival, but success in protecting innocent people from threats they could never handle independently. The living quarters that would become Zenitsu's home during his transformation from frightened youth to competent demon slayer reflected Jigoro's understanding that environmental factors could significantly influence psychological development and learning effectiveness, as comfortable but simple accommodations provided security and stability necessary for intensive training, while avoiding luxury or distraction that might undermine commitment to rigorous discipline required for mastering techniques that had been refined through generations of practitioners who had dedicated their lives to perfecting supernatural combat arts. The mountain's natural rhythms of seasonal change, weather patterns, and wildlife activity created backdrop for education that connected human development to broader natural cycles that governed all existence. The initial weeks of Zenitsu's residence at Jigoro's mountain sanctuary were characterized by psychological adjustment that proved nearly as challenging as the physical conditioning that would eventually transform his mountain capabilities. As adaptation to structured environment with clear expectations and consistent adult guidance required fundamental revision of behavioral patterns that had been shaped by years of uncertainty, neglect, and crisis management. The stability that characterized daily routines under Jigoro's supervision provided healing environment for emotional wounds, while establishing foundation for learning that required mental calm and sustained concentration impossible to achieve while struggling with basic survival concerns. The grandfather-grandson relationship that gradually developed between teacher and student transcended simple professional instruction to become genuine emotional bond that provided Zenitsu with first experience of unconditional adult acceptance and guidance since early childhood, filling psychological needs that had created desperate vulnerability to exploitation, while establishing trust that made intensive training psychologically sustainable, despite its obvious physical and mental demands. Jigoro's patient correction of behavioral patterns that reflected past trauma, combined with consistent demonstration of genuine care for Zenitsu's welfare and development, created emotional security that enabled authentic growth rather than mere performance designed to earn approval or avoid abandonment. The thunder-breathing techniques that formed the core of Jigoro's instruction represented accumulation of centuries of refinement in supernatural combat arts, each form embodying principles that had been tested through countless encounters with demons, whose power exceeded normal human ability to survive or defeat through conventional means. The philosophical framework that supported these techniques emphasized harmony between human consciousness and natural forces, teaching practitioners to channel lightning's power and speed through disciplined breathing that could enhance physical capabilities while maintaining mental clarity necessary for making split-second tactical decisions in life-or-death combat situations. The first lessons in proper breathing technique required Zenitsu to unlearn automatic patterns that had governed respiratory function throughout his life, replacing unconscious habits with deliberately controlled breathing that could serve as foundation for accessing abilities that exceeded normal human limitations through systematic application of ancient knowledge that had been preserved and refined by masters who understood connections between consciousness, breath, and physical capability that modern education systems had largely forgotten or dismissed as superstition rather than practical methodology for human development. The physical conditioning that accompanied breathing instruction pushed Zenitsu's mountain-softened body toward levels of strength, endurance, and coordination that would be necessary for wielding weapons against opponents whose supernatural capabilities made conventional self-defense techniques completely inadequate for survival, let alone victory in combat situations where hesitation or imperfect technique could result in immediate death or transformation into the very evil that demon slayers were dedicated to eliminating. The exercises that built muscle memory and reflexes had to be performed with precision that left no room for casual effort, as imperfect preparation could prove fatal when applied against enemies whose abilities had been enhanced beyond human limitations through demonic transformation. The wooden practice swords that served as training tools required development of entirely new relationships with balance, timing, and spatial awareness, as effective swordsmanship demanded integration of physical movement with mental calculation and emotional control that could be maintained even under extreme stress of combat against opponents whose strength and speed exceeded anything normal training partners could simulate. The repetitive drills that built fundamental skills were conducted with meditative focus that connected physical actions to breathing patterns and mental states that would be essential for accessing advanced techniques when circumstances demanded maximum performance, despite psychological pressure that could paralyze inadequately prepared minds. The philosophical discussions that accompanied technical instruction provided intellectual framework for understanding moral dimensions of demon slayer responsibilities, while addressing psychological challenges that came with dedicating one's life to combat against supernatural evil that most people would never encounter or believe possible, despite evidence of its existence and threat to innocent communities. Jigoro's teachings about courage, compassion, and the relationship between fear and strength offered perspective on emotional experiences that had previously seemed like weaknesses or personal failures, recontextualizing anxiety and sensitivity as potential sources of awareness and motivation that could be developed into tactical advantages. The stories that Jigoro shared about his own experiences as active demon slayer provided educational content about supernatural threats, while illustrating personal costs and rewards that came with choosing to dedicate one's life to protecting others from dangers they could neither perceive nor combat independently. These accounts of past battles, fallen comrades, and moral dilemmas faced during decades of service helped Zenitsu understand that his current struggles with fear and self-doubt were normal aspects of Demon Slayer development, rather than unique personal failings that disqualified him from meaningful contribution to efforts that required courage, but did not demand fearlessness from individuals whose compassion motivated them to act, despite natural human responses to mortal danger. The gradual development of confidence that accompanied improving physical capabilities and growing understanding of thunder-breathing principles created positive feedback cycle where success in training generated motivation for greater effort, which produced better results and deeper commitment to educational process that was transforming not only his abilities but his fundamental identity from victim of circumstances to active agent, capable of influencing outcomes through disciplined application of skills and knowledge. The moments when previously impossible techniques began feeling natural provided validation that dedication and proper instruction could overcome limitations that had seemed permanent and insurmountable. The relationship between student and teacher deepened through shared commitment to goals that transcended individual welfare to encompass protection of innocent people whose safety depended on maintaining traditions of supernatural combat that had been preserved through generations of practitioners who understood that personal sacrifice was inevitable cost of opposing evil forces whose power exceeded anything normal social institutions could address through conventional law enforcement or military intervention. The bond that developed between Jigoro and Zenitsu represented spiritual as well as educational connection, creating family relationship that filled emotional needs while providing framework for understanding purpose and identity that extended far beyond personal survival or happiness. The seasonal changes that marked passage of time during Zenitsu's basic training provided natural rhythm for measuring progress while creating varied environmental conditions that tested developing abilities against different challenges that broadened experience and prevented specialization that might prove inadequate for actual demon encounters whose circumstances could not be predicted or controlled through advanced planning. Summer heat, autumn storms, winter cold, and spring flooding each required adaptations that built psychological flexibility and physical resilience necessary for maintaining effectiveness, regardless of external conditions that might influence combat situations. The meditation practices that complemented physical training taught mental disciplines that would enable Zenitsu to function effectively, despite psychological stress that demon encounters invariably created, developing inner calm and focus that could be maintained, even when faced with horrors that would paralyze untrained minds, or when making life or death decisions under time pressure that prevented careful analysis of options and consequences. These techniques for managing fear, anger, and despair would prove as important as sword skills for survival in supernatural warfare, where mental weakness could be as deadly as physical inadequacy. The year of intensive instruction that preceded advanced training represented most transformative period in Zenitsu's life to that point, converting him from emotionally damaged youth, whose future prospects had seemed hopeless, into serious student of ancient arts, whose potential was beginning to manifest through capabilities that exceeded anything his previous experience had suggested might be possible through human effort and dedication. The foundation that this education provided would prove essential for surviving challenges that no amount of conventional preparation could adequately address, while the relationship with Jigoro would provide emotional anchor and moral guidance that sustained him through trials that tested not only physical abilities but fundamental character and commitment to principles that defined Demon Slayer. Service. The arrival of Kaigaku at Jigoro's mountain sanctuary brought with it an energy that seemed to crackle with barely contained ambition and fierce determination, his presence immediately transforming the peaceful rhythm of instruction from intimate master-student relationship into complex dynamic that would test not only individual capabilities, but the psychological resilience required for maintaining focus and motivation in an environment where comparison and competition became unavoidable aspects of daily existence. The senior disciple, who had already spent years under Jigero's tutelage, carried himself with confidence that bordered on arrogance, his movements displaying technical proficiency and physical conditioning that made Zenitsu's beginning efforts appear clumsy and inadequate, despite the progress he had achieved during his initial months of training under the former Thunder Hashira's patient guidance. Kaigaku's introduction to their shared training environment revealed personality traits that created immediate tension with Zenitsu's more tentative and anxiety-prone approach to learning ancient combat arts. As the older student's aggressive pursuit of mastery and obvious impatience with weakness or hesitation established competitive atmosphere that transformed what had been supportive educational experience into constant evaluation of relative worth and capability. His obvious disdain for Zenitsu's fearful responses to training challenges and his casual dismissal of concerns about safety or psychological comfort created social dynamic that forced the newer student to choose between maintaining defensive patterns that had protected him from further emotional damage or embracing vulnerability necessary for genuine growth, despite risk of humiliation and rejection. The contrast between their personalities became immediately apparent through their different approaches to instruction and feedback, as Kaigaku received Jigero's corrections with obvious irritation and barely concealed resentment while demonstrating technical improvements with fierce intensity that seemed driven more by desire to prove superiority than genuine commitment to principles that thunder breathing embodied. Zenitsu's more receptive attitude toward guidance and his obvious gratitude for patient instruction created stark difference in their relationships with their shared master, yet also highlighted his own insecurities about worthiness and capability that made Kaigaku's presence feel like constant reminder of his own inadequacy. The daily training sessions that brought both students together under Jigero's supervision became exercises in managing complex emotions while attempting to maintain focus on learning techniques that required complete mental engagement and precise physical execution, as the psychological pressure created by comparison and competition threatened to undermine educational process that demanded calm concentration and openness to correction. Zenitsu's natural tendency towards self-doubt and anxiety was amplified by constant exposure to Kaigaku's superior abilities and obvious confidence, creating internal dialogue that questioned his own potential, while wondering whether Jigero's investment in his development had been misguided assessment of capabilities that would never progress beyond beginner level. The sleeping arrangements that housed both disciples under the same roof intensified their interaction beyond formal training hours, creating opportunities for observation and conversation that revealed deeper aspects of their personalities while establishing social dynamic that would influence their development in ways that pure instruction could never address. Kaigaku's nighttime habits and casual comments about training, technique, and their master's methods provided insight into his character that went beyond technical proficiency to encompass attitudes about strength, weakness, and the moral framework that should guide Demon Slayer activities when faced with life or death decisions about protecting innocent people versus preserving personal safety and advancement. The philosophical differences that emerged through extended cohabitation revealed fundamental disagreements about motivation and purpose that would eventually prove crucial for understanding their different destinies within Demon Slayer. Core as Kaigaku's focus on personal achievement and recognition contrasted sharply with Zenitsu's more emotionally driven desire to prove worthy of care and protection he had received from Jigoro, despite his obvious limitations and continued struggles with fear and self-confidence. These conversations, often occurring during rest periods or meal preparation, provided education in human nature that complemented technical instruction while foreshadowing conflicts that would eventually manifest in ways that neither could anticipate during their shared apprenticeship. The incident that would forever mark Zenitsu's transformation from anxious student to lightning-touched warrior began as routine training exercise that pushed both disciples toward their current limitations while testing their commitment to continued improvement. Despite accumulated fatigue and psychological pressure that came from Jigoro's systematic increase in training intensity and complexity, the particular drill that preceded the life-changing event involved coordination exercises that required precise timing and spatial awareness, while maintaining thunder-breathing patterns under physical stress that simulated combat, conditions where perfect technique execution would be necessary for survival against supernatural opponents whose capabilities exceeded human limitations. Zenitsu's mounting panic during this especially challenging session reflected not only immediate difficulty with technical requirements, but accumulated anxiety about his continued failure to match Kaigaku's performance levels and growing fear that his limitations might eventually exhaust Jigoro's patience and result in dismissal from training that had become central to his identity and sense of purpose. The psychological pressure that built throughout the morning created emotional state where rational thought became increasingly difficult, while fight or flight responses threatened to overwhelm conscious control that proper technique required for safe and effective execution. The decision to climb the ancient tree that dominated their training ground represented desperate attempt to escape pressures that had become psychologically unbearable, as Zenitsu's fear-driven retreat from ground-level training created temporary physical distance from immediate demands, while providing elevated perspective that might enable emotional regulation and rational assessment of circumstances that ground-level anxiety had made impossible to evaluate clearly. The massive trunk that supported his weight had witnessed generations of seasonal changes and probably countless other human dramas, its solid presence offering psychological anchor during moments when internal turbulence threatened to overwhelm ability to cope with immediate challenges. The height that Zenitsu achieved in his frantic climb carried him far above normal safety limits for tree climbing, driven by panic rather than rational assessment of risk versus benefit, creating a situation where descent would prove as challenging as ascent had been, while his elevated position offered no practical solutions to training difficulties that had motivated his desperate flight from ground-level responsibilities. The branches that supported his weight swayed with mountain winds that increased both physical danger and psychological stress, as natural movement of tree structure reminded him that his precarious refuge was temporary at best, while offering no sustainable alternative to confronting fears that had driven him to seek escape through potentially dangerous elevation. The storm clouds that had been building throughout the morning began releasing their accumulated electrical energy in ways that transformed routine mountain weather into supernatural spectacle, as lightning strikes illuminated landscape with brilliant flashes that revealed terrain details normally hidden by shadows, while creating atmospheric conditions that seemed to respond to emotional intensity of human drama being played out. Beneath natural canopy, the thunder that followed each lightning discharge rolled across mountain valleys with power that seemed to dwarf human concerns, while demonstrating forces that exceeded anything individual will or determination could influence or control through conscious effort. the lightning strike that would transform Zenitsu's hair from its natural black to distinctive yellow, occurred during a moment of peak psychological vulnerability, when his fear and desperation had created mental state that made him receptive to forces that might otherwise have been deflected or absorbed without permanent effect on his consciousness or physical appearance. The electrical discharge that coursed through his body carried power that exceeded anything human nervous system should have been able to survive without permanent damage. Yet, instead of destroying or incapacitating him, the lightning seemed to awaken latent potential that had been dormant within his spiritual and physical framework until supernatural forces provided catalyst for manifestation. The immediate aftermath of the lightning strike left Zenitsu unconscious but alive, his transformed appearance serving as visible reminder that something fundamental had changed in his relationship with natural forces and possibly with his own potential for accessing abilities that exceeded normal human limitations. Through mechanisms that conventional understanding of physiology and psychology could not adequately explain, the golden color that now characterized his hair carried symbolic significance that connected him to lightning's power, while creating visual marker that would identify him throughout his future career as someone who had been touched by supernatural forces in ways that set him apart from ordinary demon slayers whose capabilities remained within normal human parameters. The recovery period that followed this transformative experience provided opportunity for Jigoro to assess what changes had occurred beyond obvious alteration in physical appearance, as careful observation revealed subtle improvements in reflexes, sensory capabilities, and intuitive understanding of thunder-breathing principles that suggested the lightning strike had created genuine enhancement rather than simply cosmetic modification that might fade over time. The former Hashira's experience with supernatural phenomena enabled him to recognize signs of authentic transformation while providing guidance for integrating new capabilities with existing training foundation that had been established through months of conventional instruction. Kaigaku's response to his training partner's lightning-induced transformation revealed aspects of his character that had remained largely concealed during their previous interactions, as obvious envy and resentment over Zenitsu's apparent divine blessing created first clear indication of competitive nature that would eventually prove incompatible with Demon Slayer principles of mutual support and shared dedication to protecting innocent people. His dismissive comments about lightning strike being mere accident rather than recognition of superior potential masked deeper insecurity about his own abilities and worthiness, despite obvious technical proficiency and years of intensive training under Jigoro's expert guidance. The training modifications that Jigoro implemented following Zenitsu's transformation reflected understanding that conventional instruction methods might prove inadequate for developing abilities that had been awakened through supernatural intervention, requiring adaptation of established teaching techniques to address capabilities that exceeded normal parameters, while maintaining safety standards that prevented dangerous experimentation with forces that remained partially understood even by experienced practitioners. The careful progression of exercises designed to explore enhanced potential without risking psychological or physical damage demonstrated masterful balance between innovation and caution that characterized truly expert instruction. The relationship between the two disciples that evolved following the lightning incident became increasingly complex, as Zenitsu's obvious enhancement created shift in power dynamic that challenged established hierarchy while forcing both young men to reconsider assumptions about relative worth and potential that had previously seemed clearly established through observable performance differences. Kaigaku's growing hostility toward his transformed training partner reflected frustration with circumstances that seemed to reward weakness and fear rather than dedicated effort and superior technique, creating philosophical crisis about fairness and merit that would influence his future choices in ways that neither he nor his instructors could anticipate. Zenitsu's continued respect for Kaigaku, despite obvious tension and barely concealed resentment, demonstrated character traits that distinguished him from purely self-interested individuals, as his recognition of his senior's genuine abilities and work ethic prevented him from allowing enhanced capabilities to create arrogance or dismissive attitude towards someone whose dedication to training had been evident throughout their shared apprenticeship. This emotional maturity, combined with his natural humility and continued gratitude toward Jigoro, created foundation for healthy development of enhanced abilities without corrupting influence of pride or superiority that might have undermined moral framework essential for Demon Slayer service. The dream that began developing in Zenitsu's imagination during this period of enhanced training and complex social dynamics involved vision of future partnership with Kaigaku, based on mutual respect and complementary abilities rather than competition and resentment that currently characterized their relationship, as his optimistic nature led him to believe that time and shared experiences would eventually overcome current difficulties, while creating genuine friendship based on common purpose and shared commitment to principles that Jigoro had taught them both. This hope for reconciliation and partnership reflected psychological resilience that enabled him to maintain positive outlook despite obvious hostility from someone whose approval and acceptance he genuinely desired. The seventh form that began taking shape in Zenitsu's practice sessions represented unprecedented innovation in thunder-breathing tradition, as his enhanced understanding of lightning's essential nature combined with emotional investment in relationship with Kaigaku to create technique that embodied both individual capability and desire for connection that transcended current circumstances. The development of original form demonstrated not only technical mastery but creative application of traditional principles that could generate new possibilities within established framework, suggesting potential for advancement within Demon Slayer hierarchy that might eventually enable contribution to core effectiveness that went beyond individual combat performance. The increasing frequency and intensity of conflicts between the two disciples created educational challenges for Jigoro that tested his wisdom and patience, while requiring diplomatic skills that went beyond technical instruction to encompass family counseling and psychological guidance for young men whose different personalities and circumstances had created tensions that threatened to undermine entire educational environment. His attempts to channel competitive energy into productive rivalry while preventing destructive conflicts that might permanently damage relationships or compromise safety during training sessions demanded constant vigilance, sophisticated understanding of human psychology that had been developed through decades of experience with diverse personality types. The technical progress that both students achieved, despite interpersonal difficulties, demonstrated effectiveness of Jigoro's instruction methods, while proving that learning could continue even in suboptimal social environments when proper structure and clear expectations were maintained through consistent adult supervision and guidance. Zenitsu's enhancement accelerated development in thunder-breathing fundamentals, contrasted with Kaigaku's superior breadth of technique mastery across multiple forms, creating different but complementary areas of expertise that might have formed basis for effective partnership if psychological barriers could have been overcome through maturation and shared experiences. The philosophical discussions that occurred during rest periods and meal times provided opportunities for both disciples to articulate their understanding of demon slayer principles while revealing different interpretations of courage, duty, and the relationship between individual advancement and service to others that reflected their contrasting personalities and life experiences. These conversations, moderated by Jigoro's wisdom and experience, offered educational value that complemented technical training while providing foundation for understanding moral framework that would guide their decisions when faced with life or death situations where personal safety might conflict with responsibilities to protect innocent people or support fellow demon slayers. The completion of basic training that marked transition from foundational instruction to advanced technique development represented achievement that both disciples had earned through dedication and perseverance, despite psychological challenges that had threatened to undermine educational process, yet also marked beginning of more specialized training phase, where individual strengths and limitations would become increasingly apparent while determining future roles within Demon Slayer hierarchy. The ceremony that acknowledged their advancement created a moment of shared celebration that temporarily transcended interpersonal tensions while providing foundation for whatever relationship might develop between them as their paths within Demon Slayer Corps began to diverge according to individual capabilities and character traits that training had revealed and refined. The completion of foundational training under Jigoro's expert guidance marked a transition that carried weight far beyond simple academic advancement, as Zenitsu's progression from terrified youth to competent practitioner of thunder breathing fundamentals represented transformation that touched every aspect of his identity, while preparing him for challenges that would test not only technical abilities but fundamental character traits that had been shaped through months of intensive instruction and personal growth. The former Hashira's assessment of his students' readiness for final selection involved evaluation criteria that encompassed psychological resilience, moral framework, and tactical judgment, alongside observable improvements in physical conditioning and technique mastery, recognizing that survival in demon-infested territory would require integration of all these elements under circumstances where weakness in any area could prove immediately fatal. The decision to permit Zenitsu's advancement to final selection reflected Jigoro's professional judgment that essential foundation had been established, despite obvious areas where continued development would be necessary, as the former Thunder Hashira understood that real-world experience with supernatural threats could provide education that mountain training could simulate but never fully replicate. His confidence in his students' potential was tempered by realistic assessment of dangers that awaited on Mount Fujikasane, where demons captured specifically for testing purposes would provide opponents whose capabilities exceeded anything practice sessions could safely approximate, while creating psychological pressures that no amount of preparation could completely address in advance. The emotional complexity of their parting reflected bonds that had developed between teacher and student through shared dedication to goals that transcended individual welfare, as Jigoro's paternal pride in Zenitsu's achievements was balanced by natural anxiety about sending someone he had grown to love into circumstances where death or transformation into the very evil they fought remained distinct possibilities despite quality of preparation that had been provided. The blessing and protective talismans that the former Hashira offered his departing student carried spiritual significance that supplemented technical training, while acknowledging forces beyond human control that might influence outcomes, regardless of skill or determination. The journey toward Mount Fujikasane required several days of travel through terrain that gradually shifted from familiar mountain paths near Jigoro's sanctuary toward landscapes that seemed increasingly touched by supernatural influence, as if the proximity of demons held captive for testing purposes had infected surrounding environment with malevolent energy that made normal wildlife behavior erratic, while creating atmospheric conditions that felt oppressive and threatening even during daylight hours when demonic activity should have been minimal. The psychological impact of this gradual transition from safe territory toward genuinely dangerous ground provided valuable preparation for mental states that would be required during actual trial period. The other candidates who had gathered for final selection represented diverse backgrounds and training traditions that illustrated various paths through which young people could arrive at decision to risk their lives in service of protecting others from supernatural threats that most humans would never encounter or believe possible, despite mounting evidence of their existence throughout Japan's modernizing society. Their ages ranged from barely adolescent to young adult. Their equipment varied from professionally crafted weapons to improvised tools that suggested desperation or poverty, and their apparent confidence levels spanned spectrum from obvious terror to aggressive bravado that might conceal deeper anxieties about what awaited them in demon-infested territory. The conversations that occurred among candidates during pre-trial gatherings revealed different motivations for pursuing Demon Slayer status, from noble dedication to protecting innocent people, to personal vengeance against demons who had destroyed families or communities, while some appeared driven by simple desire for purpose and belonging that conventional society had failed to provide through normal career opportunities or social institutions. These interactions provided Zenitsu with broader perspective on human responses to supernatural evil, while illustrating variety of personality types and moral frameworks that Demon Slayer Corps attracted through its dangerous but meaningful mission. The nervous energy that characterized pre-trial atmosphere reflected each candidate's awareness that next 7 days would determine whether years of preparation had been adequate for survival in circumstances specifically designed to test limits of human capability against opponents whose power exceeded normal parameters, yet also created opportunities for mutual support and encouragement that helped manage anxiety while building temporary alliances that might prove valuable during actual testing period. The shared meals and group discussions that filled waiting hours before trial commencement enabled formation of friendships that could provide psychological anchor during isolation and terror that individual testing would inevitably create. The formal briefing that preceded entry into demon territory provided essential tactical information about trial parameters while establishing rules that would govern survival conditions and evaluation criteria. Yet the clinical presentation of survival statistics and elimination procedures failed to convey full psychological impact of facing supernatural predators whose capabilities had been shaped by decades of consuming human flesh, while developing hunting strategies optimized for terrorizing and destroying young warriors whose experience remained largely theoretical despite quality of their training. The emphasis on 7-day duration created temporal framework that seemed simultaneously generous and impossibly brief, depending on individual confidence levels and assessment of personal capabilities. The wisteria boundary that defined safe zones carried significance beyond simple botanical curiosity, as these purple flowers represented one of few natural forces that provided reliable protection against demonic predation, while creating clearly marked transition between human safety and supernatural hunting ground, where normal rules of survival would be suspended in favor of dynamics that favored creatures whose strength, speed, and regenerative abilities had been enhanced beyond human limitations through demonic transformation. The explanation of seasonal flowering patterns and their relationship to demon behavior offered crucial tactical intelligence, while establishing environmental conditions that would influence strategic planning throughout trial period. The march into demon-infested territory began with confident steps that gradually became more cautious as reality of leaving protected space impressed itself upon candidates who had spent years preparing for this moment but had never faced genuine supernatural threats under circumstances where retreat was impossible and assistance from experienced demon slayers would be unavailable until trial period concluded successfully or ended in death or transformation. The transition from safety to danger occurred without dramatic markers, creating psychological discomfort as familiar rules about risk and security ceased to apply, while every shadow might conceal threats that could end their lives before defensive techniques could be properly deployed. The first night in demon territory provided harsh introduction to psychological pressures that would characterize entire trial period, as darkness brought with it sounds and scents that suggested supernatural presence, while creating sensory environment where normal human advantages in reasoning and tactical planning were diminished by inability to gather reliable information about immediate threats or changing conditions. The sleep that should have provided rest and recovery from days' physical exertion became fitful vigilance interrupted by every unusual noise or movement that might indicate approaching danger, creating cumulative exhaustion that would compound daily challenges while testing mental resilience alongside technical abilities. Zenitsu's enhanced hearing, developed through lightning strike and intensified through thunder breathing training, provided tactical advantages that other candidates lacked while creating psychological burden, as his ability to detect distant threats and monitor demon movements created constant awareness of dangers that remained invisible to normal human senses. The detailed acoustic information that his enhanced perception provided could guide strategic decisions about movement and positioning, yet also created anxiety about threats that other candidates remained unaware of, while forcing him to make decisions about whether warning others might compromise his own survival prospects during competition where cooperation was permitted but not required. The early encounters with demons that occurred during first days of trial provided education in practical application of training techniques against opponents whose behavior, patterns, and capabilities differed significantly from human training partners, as real demons displayed intelligence, cunning, and tactical creativity that practice sessions had been unable to simulate, while possessing supernatural abilities that required rapid adaptation of conventional approaches to combat effectiveness. The scent analysis that guided Zenitsu's tactical decisions demonstrated how enhanced senses could provide crucial intelligence about demon emotional states, physical condition, and probable intentions that visual observation might miss entirely. The isolation that characterized much of trial experience tested psychological resilience as much as combat capabilities, as extended periods without human contact or support created mental conditions where fear and self-doubt could multiply without social buffering that normal demon slayer operations provided through team coordination and mutual encouragement. The silence that filled intervals between demon encounters became a oppressive reminder of individual vulnerability, while providing too much time for contemplating possible failure scenarios that could undermine confidence and tactical effectiveness when actual threats required immediate response, based on training rather than fearful speculation about inadequate preparation. The successful elimination of multiple demons through efficient application of thunder-breathing first form provided validation that specialized training focus could prove more effective than attempting to master complete repertoire of technique, as Zenitsu's lightning-fast strikes demonstrated how perfection in single approach could overcome supernatural opponents whose diverse abilities might have overwhelmed more conventionally trained demon slayers whose skills were distributed across broader range of techniques without achieving equivalent mastery in any individual area. The prayers that he offered for destroyed demons reflected moral framework that recognized their former humanity while accepting necessity of their elimination for protection of innocent people. The deeper penetration into demon territory that his early successes enabled brought encounters with increasingly dangerous opponents, whose capabilities tested limits of his current abilities while providing practical experience with tactical adaptation and creative problem-solving under circumstances where conventional approaches proved inadequate for achieving reliable results. The gradient of threat levels that characterized trial environment ensured that candidates who survived initial encounters would face progressively greater challenges that measured not only ability to execute learned techniques, but capacity for growth and adaptation when confronted with situations that training had been unable to anticipate or simulate completely. The physical exhaustion that accumulated through days of constant vigilance and repeated combat created additional challenge as fatigue began affecting reaction time, decision-making quality, and precision in technique execution that could prove fatal when facing opponents who showed no signs of tiring while possessing regenerative abilities that enabled recovery from injuries that would incapacitate human fighters. The management of personal resources became crucial tactical consideration as trial period extended beyond initial adrenaline-fueled encounters towards sustained campaign that required pacing and conservation of energy for challenges that might prove more demanding than anything previously faced. The psychological transformation that occurred through successful demon elimination began shifting Zenitsu's self-perception from fearful student toward competent warrior, as repeated validation of his abilities through surviving encounters that claimed lives of other candidates provided evidence that training had been more effective than his anxiety and self-doubt had previously allowed him to believe. The confidence that grew through practical success created positive feedback cycle, where improved performance generated motivation for greater effort and risk-taking that enabled engagement with more challenging opponents who provided opportunities for continued development and skill. Refinement. The final day of trial period brought with it mixture of relief at approaching completion and anxiety about whether survival alone would be sufficient for demonstrating readiness for Demon Slayer service, as some candidates who had managed to avoid elimination during 7-day period had done so through hiding and evasion rather than active engagement with supernatural threats that testing was designed to measure. The morning light that marked end of trial carried promise of return to human civilization, while creating uncertainty about evaluation criteria and standards that would determine acceptance into core membership versus requirement for additional training before being deemed ready for operational deployment. The emergence from Mount Fujikasane at conclusion of trial period revealed dramatically reduced number of survivors among candidates who had entered demon territory with hope and determination 7 days earlier, as harsh mathematics of supernatural warfare had eliminated majority of aspirants despite quality of their preparation and intensity of their motivation to join organization dedicated to protecting innocent people from threats they could neither perceive nor combat independently. The congratulations offered to survivors carried weight of recognition that they had demonstrated capabilities sufficient for membership in elite organization, whose standards were measured through life or death trials rather than academic assessments or simulated exercises. The Kasugai bird assignment that marked formal acceptance into Demon Slayer Corps provided each new member with communication link to organizational structure while creating permanent connection to support systems that would enable coordination of operations across geographic distances that individual demon slayers could never traverse independently. The sparrow that was assigned to Zenitsu rather than Standard Crow represented accommodation of his unique characteristics, while suggesting that unconventional approaches might be necessary for managing operative whose psychological profile and enhanced abilities differed from typical demon slayer parameters in ways that required specialized support and guidance. The Nichiren blade selection process that concluded formal induction ceremonies provided each new demon slayer with primary weapon, whose effectiveness against supernatural opponents had been proven through generations of use, while enabling personalization that could optimize combat effectiveness. Through attention to individual fighting styles and physical characteristics that influenced weapon handling and tactical approaches, the anticipation that accompanied blade forging period created final transition phase between trial completion and operational readiness, as proper weaponry represented essential equipment, without which even qualified demon slayers would be inadequately prepared for field deployment against enemies whose supernatural abilities required specialized tools for reliable elimination. The return journey from final selection carried with it weight of transformation that extended far beyond simple completion of required testing, as Zenitsu's survival had validated not only technical preparation, but fundamental character traits that had enabled him to overcome psychological barriers while functioning effectively in circumstances that had claimed lives of candidates whose training might have been superior, but whose mental resilience had proven inadequate for sustained performance under conditions of extreme stress and mortal danger. The knowledge that he now possessed, practical experience with demon combat, created foundation for confidence that no amount of theoretical instruction could have provided, while establishing credibility within core hierarchy that would influence assignment of future missions and opportunities for advancement toward greater responsibility and influence within organizational structure dedicated to protecting human civilization from supernatural threats. The bustling streets of the mountain town where Zenitsu's first independent mission would begin stretched before him like a maze of unfamiliar sights, sounds, and human activity that overwhelmed senses that had been trained to detect supernatural threats in wilderness environments, but were unprepared for the sensory complexity that characterized human settlements, where countless individual stories intersected in patterns too intricate for any single observer to comprehend completely. The transition from mountain solitude, where every sound and scent carried clear significance, toward urban chaos, where meaningful signals were buried beneath layers of irrelevant information, created psychological disorientation that made him question whether his enhanced perception abilities would prove more hindrance than advantage in environments that had not been designed with Demon Slayer operations in mind. The mission parameters that had brought him to this particular location involved reports of mysterious disappearances that suggested demonic activity, yet the lack of obvious supernatural indicators in daylight hours created uncertainty about whether his investigative approach should prioritize conventional detective work or immediate preparation for combat encounters that might occur without warning if demons were indeed operating in populated areas where civilian safety would become primary consideration, alongside elimination of supernatural threats. The weight of independent responsibility for mission success pressed against psychological framework that had been shaped through months of guided training, where Jigoro's wisdom and experience had provided safety net for decision-making processes that now required autonomous judgment about tactics and priorities. The young woman who became focus of Zenitsu's desperate romantic pursuit represented everything his emotionally starved psyche craved, while embodying reminder of vulnerabilities that had nearly destroyed his life before Jigoro's intervention had provided alternative path toward purpose and identity that transcended simple survival or personal happiness. Her obvious discomfort with his aggressive courtship approach should have served as clear indication that his behavior was inappropriate and counterproductive, yet his psychological needs and social inexperience prevented recognition that genuine relationships could not be forced through persistence or dramatic gestures that prioritized his emotional satisfaction over her comfort and autonomy. The marriage proposal that he delivered with desperate intensity in public setting reflected not authentic romantic feeling but panic-driven attempt to establish human connection that might provide emotional anchor during mission that represented first test of his ability to function independently as demon slayer without supervisory support or guidance from more experienced practitioners. His belief that immediate marriage would somehow guarantee survival of upcoming dangerous encounter revealed magical thinking that substituted wishful fantasy for realistic assessment of factors that would actually influence mission outcomes, demonstrating how anxiety could distort rational analysis of cause and effect, relationships in ways that created additional problems rather than addressing underlying concerns. The intervention of Tanjiro Kamado in this embarrassing social situation provided Zenitsu with first encounter with Peer, whose demon slayer training had produced different personality traits and approaches to interpersonal relationships. As the water-breathing practitioner's natural empathy and social awareness enabled him to diffuse potentially escalating conflict while protecting both Zenitsu's dignity and the young woman's safety through gentle but firm redirection of attention toward more appropriate concerns. The graceful manner in which Tanjiro managed this delicate social intervention demonstrated maturity and emotional intelligence that contrasted sharply with Zenitsu's desperate flailing, while providing example of how Demon Slayer principles could be applied to civilian interactions as well as supernatural combat situations. The conversation that developed between the two young Demon Slayers revealed fundamental differences in their backgrounds and motivations, while establishing foundation for friendship that would prove essential for both their survival, psychological well-being throughout challenges that neither could have faced successfully in isolation from mutual support and encouragement. Tanjiro's patient listening and non-judgmental response to Zenitsu's confession about his history of financial exploitation and romantic betrayal created safe space for emotional vulnerability while providing perspective that helped contextualize past trauma as learning experience, rather than permanent character flaw that disqualified him from meaningful relationships or successful Demon Slayer service. The explanation of circumstances that had led to his Demon Slayer training provided Tanjiro with insight into personality traits and psychological patterns that would influence their future partnership, while Zenitsu's willingness to share painful details about his exploitation and abandonment demonstrated trust that marked beginning of genuine friendship based on mutual respect and acceptance, rather than superficial cooperation that might dissolve under stress of dangerous missions. The understanding that developed through this honest communication would prove crucial for maintaining team cohesion when facing threats that tested not only individual capabilities, but collective morale and determination to protect each other alongside civilian populations that depended on their success. The shared meal that marked their transition from strangers to partners carried symbolic significance that transcended simple nutrition, as breaking bread together represented commitment to mutual support that would be tested through circumstances where personal survival might conflict with obligations to protect companions whose welfare had become intertwined with individual success. The simple rice that they consumed provided energy for upcoming mission, while creating moments of peaceful connection that would be remembered during darker times when friendship seemed like luxury that dangerous circumstances could not accommodate alongside practical requirements for staying alive. The journey toward their assigned destination through mountain terrain that grew increasingly ominous with each step away from human civilization provided opportunity for continued conversation and relationship building, while gradually introducing environmental conditions that would characterize their shared mission, as familiar landscapes gave way to wilderness areas where supernatural influence had created atmospheric conditions that made normal wildlife behavior erratic, while generating psychological pressure that tested mental resilience alongside physical conditioning. The weight of their equipment and supplies created steady rhythm of movement that enabled sustained discussion while building comfort with each other's presence that would prove essential when circumstances required absolute trust and coordination without time for hesitation or second-guessing. The large house that dominated their assigned operational area appeared through forest shadows like manifestation of architectural impossibility, its structure defying conventional understanding of physics and engineering through spatial relationships that seemed to shift according to supernatural will rather than natural law. The building's ominous presence created immediate sense that their mission would involve challenges that exceeded simple demon elimination to encompass blood demon art manipulation of environmental conditions in ways that would make navigation and tactical planning exponentially more difficult than standard outdoor encounters where terrain remained predictable and controllable through conventional means. The scent analysis that Tanjiro conducted upon approaching the mysterious structure provided crucial intelligence about supernatural presence while demonstrating enhanced sensory capabilities that complemented Zenitsu's superior hearing in ways that created tactical advantages through combined perception abilities that neither could have achieved independently. The unfamiliar odor signatures that Tanjiro detected suggested demonic activity that involved manipulation of space and reality rather than simple predation, indicating opponents whose blood demon arts would require creative countermeasures that standard combat training had not specifically addressed, but which their combined abilities might enable them to overcome through cooperation and adaptability. The sounds that reached Zenitsu's enhanced hearing painted an acoustic picture of the house's interior that revealed supernatural manipulation of architecture while providing early warning about dangers that awaited investigation, as impossible spatial relationships created sound patterns that violated normal expectations about how audio signatures should behave in conventional building structures. The analysis of these acoustic anomalies provided tactical intelligence about environmental hazards while creating psychological preparation for encounters with demons whose capabilities exceeded simple physical enhancement to encompass reality manipulation that could trap or disorient opponents through alteration of fundamental assumptions about navigation and positioning. The children who approached them with obvious terror and desperate pleas for help regarding their missing brother represented both mission objective and immediate tactical consideration, as Shoichi and Taruko's presence created civilian protection responsibilities that would complicate combat operations while providing moral imperative that demanded immediate action despite increased risk and operational complexity. Their frightened accounts of monster activity within the house provided crucial intelligence about supernatural threats while establishing emotional stakes that transformed abstract mission parameters into personal commitment to protecting innocent people whose welfare had become intertwined with successful completion of assigned objectives. The decision to provide assistance despite obvious dangers reflected both Demon Slayer's commitment to principles that prioritize civilian safety over personal security considerations, as their willingness to accept increased risk for protection of children they had never previously encountered, demonstrated moral framework that distinguished genuine Demon Slayers from individuals whose motivation might focus primarily on personal advancement or glory rather than service to others. The comfort that they attempted to provide through gentle words and reassuring presence helped manage children's terror, while creating psychological foundation for cooperation that would be necessary for coordinating protective efforts with investigation and elimination activities. The sparrow that Zenitsu introduced as means of calming frightened children demonstrated how unconventional aspects of his Demon Slayer equipment could serve multiple purposes beyond simple communication, as the small bird's presence provided distraction from immediate terror while creating opportunity for building trust and rapport that might prove crucial if circumstances required civilian cooperation during combat operations. The children's positive response to this gesture revealed how small acts of kindness could create significant improvements in psychological conditions that affected everyone's ability to function effectively under stress of supernatural crisis. The promise that both Demon Slayers made regarding rescue of the missing brother established clear mission parameters, while creating accountability that would influence tactical decisions throughout upcoming encounters, as their commitment to specific outcome rather than general elimination of threats required approaches that prioritize preservation of innocent life over efficiency or safety of combat operations. This dedication to protecting individuals rather than simply destroying demons reflected moral sophistication that distinguished their approach to supernatural warfare from purely tactical considerations that might sacrifice civilian welfare for operational convenience. The entry into the supernatural house that would test every aspect of their training and partnership began with immediate separation that demonstrated how blood demon art environmental manipulation could neutralize numerical advantages by preventing coordinated response between team members whose individual capabilities might prove insufficient for challenges that required collective effort and mutual support. The disorientation that followed their spatial division created psychological pressure that tested confidence and decision-making abilities while forcing rapid adaptation to circumstances where normal assumptions about teamwork and communication no longer applied according to conventional expectations. Zenitsu's assignment to protect Shoichi while navigating supernaturally altered architecture created dual responsibility that required balancing civilian safety with personal survival while maintaining effectiveness against threats whose capabilities remained unknown until direct encounter provided intelligence that might arrive too late for tactical adjustment. The child's obvious terror amplified his own anxiety while creating additional pressure to project confidence and competence that he was not entirely certain he possessed when facing supernatural opponents without benefit of Tanjiro's support and complementary abilities that had made their partnership seem capable of overcoming any challenge through combined effort. The unconscious combat abilities that emerged when terror overwhelmed Zenitsu's conscious control represented psychological adaptation that enabled access to capabilities that fear normally prevented him from utilizing effectively, as sleep fighting episodes demonstrated how thunder-breathing techniques could be executed with precision and power that exceeded his waking performance levels, despite apparent contradiction between unconscious state and complex motor coordination required for advanced swordsmanship. The thunder-breathing first form that manifested during these episodes achieved levels of speed and effectiveness that conscious effort had never been able to match, suggesting that psychological barriers, rather than physical limitations, were primary obstacles to realizing his full potential. The demon elimination that occurred during his unconscious state provided practical validation of enhanced abilities while creating mystery about mechanisms that enabled superior performance when normal awareness was suspended, as witnesses could observe results without understanding processes that had achieved them. The precision cuts and lightning-fast movement that characterized his sleep fighting demonstrated mastery that seemed to contradict his conscious fears and self-doubt, creating paradox that would require deeper understanding of psychological factors that influenced access to training-developed capabilities under different mental conditions. The awakening that followed successful demon elimination left Zenitsu without memory of his actions or understanding of how threats had been overcome, creating confusion about his own role in mission success, while preventing psychological integration of experiences that might have built confidence and reduced anxiety about future encounters. The gratitude that he expressed toward Shoichi for supposedly defeating Demon reflected genuine humility, while demonstrating how incomplete self-awareness could prevent recognition of personal achievements that might have served as foundation for improved self-image and tactical confidence. The reunion with Tanjiro following completion of their respective challenges within the supernatural house provided opportunity for sharing experiences and comparing observations about demon capabilities and blood demon artifacts that had influenced their individual encounters, while re-establishing partnership that had proven its value through successful navigation of complex tactical situation despite forced separation. The mutual relief at discovering each other's survival created emotional foundation for continued cooperation, while providing validation that their friendship could endure stressful circumstances where individual survival might have seemed to require purely selfish focus. The encounter with Inosuke Hashibira announced itself through sounds of violence and obvious combat skills that immediately identified him as fellow demon slayer, whose approach to supernatural warfare differed dramatically from anything their training had prepared them to understand or accommodate within conventional operational frameworks. The boar mask that concealed his features suggested connection to wilderness survival techniques, while his aggressive behavior patterns indicated personality traits that would create challenges for team integration despite obvious combat effectiveness that might prove valuable for missions requiring direct confrontation with powerful supernatural opponents. The territorial behavior and obvious hostility that Inosuke displayed toward other demon slayers reflected social development that had occurred outside normal human community, creating personality patterns that prioritized individual dominance over cooperative effectiveness, while maintaining capabilities that made his antisocial tendencies tolerable within contexts where results mattered more than social harmony. His immediate challenge to their authority and competence would require careful management to channel aggressive energy toward productive activities while preventing destructive conflicts that might compromise mission effectiveness or team cohésion durant future opérations. The revelation about Nezuko's nature that occurred when Inosuke attempted to attack the box containing Tanjiro's transformed sister created crisis that tested both friendship and institutional loyalty, as Demon Slayer doctrine demanded elimination of all demons, regardless of apparent retention of human characteristics, while personal bonds and direct observation suggested that conventional understanding of demon nature might be inadequate for addressing unprecedented circumstances. Zenitsu's enhanced hearing had already provided him with acoustic evidence that something unusual about Tanjiro's traveling companion, yet his acceptance of the situation demonstrated trust in friendship that transcended organizational protocols. The defense of Nezuko against Inosuke's aggressive elimination attempts required both demon slayers to prioritize relationship loyalty over institutional compliance, while accepting risks that such decisions might create for their standing within demon slayer hierarchy and future mission. Assignments. The physical confrontation that developed when reasoning failed to resolve ideological conflict demonstrated how strongly held principles could create irreconcilable differences between individuals whose shared commitment to protecting innocent people should have provided common ground for cooperation and mutual respect. The resolution of conflict through Tanjiro's unconventional headbutt technique provided practical demonstration of how creative problem-solving could overcome superior physical strength when conventional approaches proved inadequate, while establishing dominance hierarchy that enabled continued partnership despite fundamental disagreement about appropriate treatment of demons who retained human consciousness. The effectiveness of this unorthodox combat method against skilled opponent validated innovation over rigid adherence to prescribed techniques when circumstances required adaptive responses to unique challenges. The burial ceremony that they conducted for victims discovered within the demon's house reflected moral framework that honored human dignity even after death, while providing psychological closure for traumatic discoveries that had revealed extent of supernatural predation in area. The prayers and respectful treatment of remains demonstrated commitment to values that transcended tactical considerations, acknowledging that demon slayer service existed to preserve human worth and dignity, rather than simply eliminating threats through efficient violence without regard for broader moral implications of their activities. The recovery period at Wisteria House that followed successful completion of their first shared mission provided opportunity for processing experiences and building relationships that would prove essential for future operations, as comfortable environment and absence of immediate threats enabled emotional healing while creating space for developing understanding and friendship that dangerous circumstances normally prevented through constant focus on survival requirements. The elderly caretaker who provided hospitality represented civilian support network that enabled demon slayer operations through services that supplemented combat capabilities with logistical assistance and safe havens. The formation of their trio through shared trials and mutual acceptance created partnership that would prove more effective than some of individual capabilities, as their complementary abilities and personality traits provided collective strength that could address wider range of challenges than any single demon slayer could handle independently. The bonds forged through dangerous circumstances and mutual protection established foundation for trust and cooperation that would sustain them through increasingly difficult missions where individual survival would depend absolutely on team cohesion and unwavering commitment to shared objectives that prioritized protection of others over personal safety or advancement within organizational hierarchy. The mountain that rose before them like a monument to primordial darkness carried atmospheric weight that seemed to press against their souls with malevolent intent. As Mount Natagumo stood silhouetted against evening sky like cancerous growth on landscape, whose very presence suggested corruption of natural order through supernatural forces that had claimed this territory as hunting ground for creatures whose power exceeded anything their previous missions had prepared them to face. The forest that began where normal vegetation ended created transition zone between familiar natural environment and realm, where different rules applied to survival, navigation, and basic assumptions about reality that human consciousness required for maintaining sanity and operational effectiveness under circumstances that would test every aspect of their training and character. The briefing that had brought their newly formed team to this ominous location spoke of demon slayers who had ascended these slopes. In response to reports of supernatural activity only to turn against each other in acts of violence that contradicted every principle of core training and mutual support that should have prevented such fratricidal behavior under any conceivable circumstances. The implications of these reports suggested blood demon art capabilities that exceeded simple physical manipulation to encompass psychological control that could override conscious will and transform allies into enemies through mechanisms that conventional training had never addressed or prepared operatives to resist through mental discipline or tactical awareness. The trees that dominated this cursed landscape seemed to lean inward with deliberate hostility, their branches intertwining overhead to block moonlight and create perpetual twilight that favored creatures whose enhanced senses and supernatural abilities provided advantages that human operatives could only overcome through superior technique and unwavering determination despite psychological pressure that accumulated with each step deeper into territory where normal rules of cause and effect had been suspended through demonic influence. The undergrowth that carpeted forest floor showed signs of unnatural growth patterns and seasonal changes that violated botanical principles while creating terrain hazards that could trap unwary travelers in situations where escape might prove impossible without supernatural assistance. The scent analysis that Tanjiro conducted as they penetrated deeper into demon territory revealed olfactory signatures that painted disturbing picture of what had befallen missing demon slayers, as mingled aromas of fear, pain, and supernatural corruption created complex bouquet that told story of human suffering and demonic predation, exceeding normal patterns of supernatural warfare. The layered scent suggested multiple demons working in coordination rather than individual predators operating according to typical territorial behavior, indicating organized threat that would require tactical approaches different from anything their previous experience had taught them about demon elimination and survival in hostile environments. Zenitsu's enhanced hearing provided complementary intelligence that supplemented visual and olfactory information with acoustic details that revealed movement patterns and emotional states of creatures that remained hidden within forest depths, as his ability to detect heartbeats, breathing patterns, and subtle sounds of movement through vegetation created tactical awareness that could guide strategic decisions about routes, timing, and positioning that might prove crucial for avoiding unnecessary confrontations while maintaining mission effectiveness. The constant background noise of supernatural activity that his enhanced perception revealed created psychological burden, as awareness of surrounding threats made relaxation or rest impossible, despite physical exhaustion that accumulated. Through careful navigation of dangerous terrain, the discovery of Murata, cowering behind fallen log with obvious signs of psychological trauma that had reduced him from competent demon slayer to terrified survivor whose rational thinking had been overwhelmed by experiences too horrific for normal human consciousness to process and integrate, provided, first, concrete evidence of supernatural forces they were facing, while demonstrating how quickly confidence could be shattered by encounters that exceeded preparation and training. His fragmented account of demon slayers attacking each other painted picture of supernatural influence that could turn protective instincts into destructive compulsions through mechanisms that remained mysterious but obviously effective in creating chaos within organized resistance to demonic predation. The puppet strings that had controlled attacking demon slayers represented blood demon art that violated fundamental assumptions about individual autonomy and free will, creating tactical situation where normal approaches to combat and cooperation became impossible when allies could be transformed into enemies through supernatural manipulation that overrode conscious choice and moral commitment to protecting innocent people. The sight of human bodies moving according to demonic will, rather than personal volition, challenged basic understanding of what distinguished human from monster, while creating immediate threat assessment problems that conventional training had never addressed through simulation or theoretical instruction. The mother spider demon, whose web of control had reduced brave warriors to marionettes dancing according to her malevolent choreography, embodied form of evil that transcended simple predation to encompass deliberate corruption of 12, everything noble and protective about human nature, transforming those who had dedicated their lives to saving others into instruments of destruction that betrayed every principle they had sworn to uphold through demon slayer service. Her casual manipulation of human souls revealed depth of malice that exceeded hunger or territorial instinct to encompass pure enjoyment of suffering and moral degradation that made her elimination moral imperative rather than simple tactical objective. The decision that Zenitsu made to refuse entry into forest territory reflected psychological self-preservation instincts that recognized threat levels exceeding his current capabilities and confidence, as his enhanced hearing provided acoustic intelligence about supernatural activity within demon-controlled area. That painted picture of dangers that might prove impossible to survive despite quality of training and support from capable teammates. His adamant refusal to accompany Tanjiro and Inosuke into obviously dangerous territory demonstrated how fear could override loyalty and duty when psychological pressure exceeded individual capacity for managing terror that threatened to paralyze rational decision-making processes. The internal debate that raged within his consciousness as his companions disappeared into forest shadows involved conflict between natural survival instincts that demanded retreat from obviously lethal situation and moral obligations that required him to support teammates whose success might depend on assistance that only his unique capabilities could provide during encounters with supernatural opponents. The shame that accompanied his refusal to join dangerous mission was compounded by awareness that his enhanced hearing and lightning-fast combat techniques might prove crucial for achieving objectives that could save innocent lives, while preventing further demon slayer casualties in area where organized supernatural resistance had already proven capable of corrupting and destroying experienced operatives. The realization that Tanjiro had taken Nezuko with him into demon territory created emotional crisis that transcended simple concern for teammate welfare to encompass protective instincts towards someone whose vulnerability and innocence demanded defense regardless of personal cost or risk to individual survival. The knowledge that both brother and sister were facing dangers that had already proven capable of corrupting and controlling experienced demon slayers transformed abstract tactical considerations into deeply personal mission that made retreat impossible despite psychological terror that continued to threaten rational analysis of circumstances and available options for meaningful contribution to their safety. The decision to follow his friends into forest despite overwhelming fear represented triumph of loyalty and moral commitment over self-preservation instincts that had temporarily overwhelmed his capacity for rational decision-making about duty and honor that defined demon slayer service. The courage required for this choice went beyond simple physical bravery to encompass psychological victory over terror that had threatened to prevent him from fulfilling obligations to people whose welfare had become more important than Nace. His own survival or comfort in situations where individual safety might conflict with responsibilities to protect others. The forest environment that surrounded him as he penetrated deeper into spider demon territory created sensory overload that tested his enhanced hearing abilities while providing tactical intelligence about supernatural threats that conventional observation methods would have been unable to detect or interpret correctly. The acoustic landscape revealed layer upon layer of demonic activity, including movement patterns, emotional states, and probable locations of creatures whose presence would remain hidden from normal human senses until direct confrontation provided information that might arrive too late for defensive preparation or strategic adjustment. The human head with spider body that marked his first direct encounter with results of spider demon transformation demonstrated how completely supernatural corruption could alter human form while preserving consciousness that made victims aware of their monstrous condition without providing any means for resistance or escape from nightmare existence. The horror of witnessing this perversion of human nature created psychological impact that threatened to overwhelm his already strained mental resilience while providing crucial intelligence about spider demon capabilities and transformation processes that would influence tactical decisions throughout remaining mission activities. The flight response that this discovery triggered reflected natural human reaction to encountering horrors that exceeded psychological capacity for processing and integration within normal frameworks for understanding reality. As his enhanced hearing continued providing acoustic intelligence about pursuing threats, while his conscious mind struggled to maintain rational analysis of circumstances that seemed to violate fundamental assumptions about possibility and limitation within natural order, the desperate retreat through forest terrain that had been modified through spider demon influence created additional hazards while preventing careful navigation that might have enabled more effective evasion of pursuing supernatural predators. The encounter with Sun Spider Demon, who was responsible for human transformations into spider hybrid creatures, represented escalation to direct combat against opponent whose blood demon art created time pressure that transformed tactical situation from simple elimination mission into desperate race against biological clock that would determine whether rescue was possible or whether he would join ranks of transformed victims whose humanity had been preserved only to make their monstrous existence more psychologically torturous. The spider bite that infected him with transformation poison created countdown scenario where success required not only defeating powerful opponent, but doing so within specific time limit that made conventional tactical approaches inadequate for circumstances that demanded immediate decisive action. The 30-minute deadline that accompanied spider transformation poison created psychological pressure that could have paralyzed decision-making processes through terror of impending doom, yet also provided clarity about priorities and necessity for immediate action that eliminated luxury of careful planning or gradual approach to combat engagement that might have been appropriate under less urgent circumstances. The knowledge that failure to defeat Spider Demon within specific time frame would result in permanent transformation into creature that retained human consciousness while being trapped within monstrous form created stakes that made personal survival secondary to achieving victory that could prevent fate worse than death. The unconsciousness that claimed him as fear overwhelmed psychological capacity for maintaining rational control, represented protective mechanism that enabled access to capabilities that conscious terror had been preventing him from utilizing effectively, as sleep fighting abilities manifested with precision and power that exceeded anything his waking performance had achieved during training or previous combat encounters. The thunder-breathing techniques that emerged during unconscious state demonstrated mastery that fear had been blocking while revealing potential that proper psychological conditions could unlock, despite apparent contradiction between sleep and complex motor coordination required for advanced swordsmanship. The flashback sequences that accompanied unconscious combat performance provided psychological context for understanding relationship between current crisis and foundational experiences that had shaped his character and capabilities, as memories of Jigoro's patient encouragement and unwavering faith in his potential created emotional foundation for accessing abilities that conscious self-doubt had made unavailable during waking states. The contrast between supportive teaching environment and hostile supernatural combat situation highlighted how psychological conditions could influence performance levels while demonstrating importance of mental framework for achieving optimal results under pressure. The memory of Kaigaku's contempt and dismissive attitude toward his limitations created parallel emotional resonance that transformed current combat situation into opportunity for proving worth and capability that had been questioned by someone whose opinion had carried significant psychological weight despite obvious personality flaws and character deficiencies. The desire to demonstrate that dedication and heart could overcome apparent weakness provided motivational framework that enabled sustained effort despite physical and mental exhaustion that might otherwise have prevented continued resistance against overwhelming supernatural opposition. The perfection of thunder-breathing first form that enabled victory over Spider Demon represented culmination of training philosophy that emphasized mastery of single technique rather than superficial competence across broad range of abilities, as his lightning-fast strikes achieved levels of speed and precision that made elaborate tactical combinations unnecessary, when fundamental approach had been refined to point where individual technique could overcome opponents whose power seemed to exceed human capability to resist or defeat. The philosophical implications of achieving excellence through focused dedication rather than scattered effort validated training approach that had initially seemed limiting compared to more comprehensive educational programs. The elimination of Spider Demon through repeated application of perfectly executed first form demonstrated how persistence and precision could overcome supernatural regeneration and enhanced physical capabilities when technique was applied with sufficient speed and accuracy to prevent defensive, adaptation, or counterattack strategies. The thunderclap and flash technique that characterized his signature approach achieved results that more complex combinations might not have produced, while validating training philosophy that prioritized depth over breadth in skill development. The poison neutralization that followed successful demon elimination provided immediate relief from transformation countdown, while creating opportunity for conscious integration of experiences that had occurred during sleep fighting episode, as return to normal awareness enabled him to process tactical lessons and psychological insights that unconscious combat performance had generated through successful application of enhanced capabilities under circumstances that conscious fear had previously made impossible to access effectively. The physical recovery that accompanied victory created foundation for continued mission participation while building confidence that could influence future performance under similar high-stress circumstances. The awakening that restored conscious control over his actions left him without clear memory of combat techniques that had enabled victory, creating disconnection between achieved results and understanding of processes that had produced them, while preventing psychological integration of success that might have reduced anxiety about future encounters with supernatural opponents. The confusion about his own role in demon elimination reflected how unconscious competence could achieve results that conscious effort had been unable to produce. suggesting that psychological barriers rather than physical limitations were primary obstacles to realizing full potential. The rescue that brought him back to rejoin mission activities provided opportunity for reunion with teammates, while enabling coordination of individual successes into collective achievement that addressed original mission parameters through combined efforts that none of them could have accomplished independently. The mutual relief at discovering survival of all team members created emotional foundation for continued partnership, while providing validation that their collective capabilities could overcome challenges that individual effort might have found insurmountable, despite quality of training and dedication to mission objectives. The medical attention that was required for treating spider poison effects and accumulated combat injuries provided practical reminder that Demon Slayer service involved real physical costs that could permanently affect health and capability if proper medical care was not available following dangerous missions that pushed human endurance beyond normal, sustainable limits. The treatment process created opportunity for reflection on experiences, while beginning physical recovery that would be necessary for returning to operational readiness for future assignments. The debriefing process that enabled sharing of individual experiences during separated combat encounters provided tactical intelligence about spider demon capabilities and blood demon artifacts, while creating collective understanding of threat patterns that might prove valuable for future operations in similar environments where environmental manipulation and psychological warfare played significant roles in supernatural predation strategies. The lessons learned through practical experience would influence approaches to training and preparation for missions that might involve similar challenges to individual and collective effectiveness. The psychological processing of successful mission completion, despite overwhelming fear and initial refusal to participate, provided foundation for growth in confidence and self-understanding that could influence future performance under pressure, as evidence of unconscious competence suggested capabilities that conscious self-doubt had been preventing from manifestation during normal circumstances. The knowledge that dedication and proper training could overcome apparent limitations when circumstances demanded maximum effort created framework for continued development that might eventually enable access to enhanced abilities during conscious states, rather than requiring unconscious conditions. For optimal performance, the butterfly mansion that would serve as sanctuary for Zenitsu's recovery from Mount Natagumo's horrors rose from manicured gardens like architectural embodiment of healing and tranquility, its traditional design principles harmonizing with natural landscape in ways that created atmosphere of peace and restoration after the supernatural violence that had tested every aspect of his physical and psychological resilience during encounters with spider demons whose power had pushed him beyond normal human limitations. The estate that Shinobu Kocho had developed into medical facility and training ground represented fusion of ancient healing arts with scientific innovation that created therapeutic capabilities exceeding anything available through conventional medical practice, while providing environment where demon slayers could recover from injuries that would have proven fatal without specialized knowledge of supernatural trauma and its effects on human physiology. The approach to the mansion through carefully maintained pathways bordered by flowering plants whose beauty seemed deliberately chosen to provide psychological comfort after exposure to demonic corruption revealed attention to environmental factors that could influence healing processes beyond simple physical treatment, as visual harmony and natural fragrances created sensory experience that helped counteract memories of horror and violence that could interfere with recovery if mental wounds were not addressed alongside bodily injuries. The butterfly motifs that appeared throughout architectural details and garden design reflected not only personal aesthetic preferences, but philosophical approach to transformation that recognized how apparent fragility could conceal extraordinary strength when properly developed and directed toward meaningful purposes. The medical examination that began Zenitsu's treatment process provided comprehensive assessment of physical damage while revealing psychological stress indicators that required attention alongside visible injuries, as Shinobu's expertise in both conventional medicine and supernatural physiology enabled her to identify effects of spider, demon poison that might have caused permanent harm if left untreated. Despite successful mission completion, that had prevented immediate transformation. Her analytical approach to diagnosis combined scientific methodology with intuitive understanding of how demonic encounters affected human consciousness in ways that purely physical examination might miss entirely. The insect Hashira, whose gentle demeanor concealed depths of knowledge and tactical capability that had earned her position among Demon Slayer Corps elite, demonstrated how feminine approach to supernatural warfare could achieve results through precision and intelligence rather than brute force. While her medical background provided perspective on demon physiology that complemented combat training with scientific understanding of transformation processes and vulnerability factors that could be exploited through properly applied treatments. Her calm presence created reassuring environment that enabled emotional healing alongside physical recovery, while providing example of how strength could manifest through compassion and intellectual capability rather than obvious displays of power. The enhanced senses that Zenitsu possessed through lightning strike and thunder-breathing training provided him with unusual insight into Shinobu's emotional state and psychological complexity, as his ability to detect subtle audio cues revealed irregularities in her breathing patterns and vocal tonality that suggested internal struggles and emotional pain that her composed exterior was designed to conceal from casual observation. The understanding that someone whose role involved healing others carried her own unresolved trauma created empathetic connection, while demonstrating how personal suffering could be transformed into motivation for preventing similar pain in others through dedicated service that transcended individual concerns. The sound that he detected beneath Shinobu's gentle words and professional manner carried notes of suppressed anger and unresolved grief that had been channeled into systematic approach to demon elimination through scientific methods that could achieve more efficient results than conventional sword techniques alone, as her development of poison-based combat approaches reflected both intellectual creativity and emotional investment in finding ways to overcome supernatural opponents whose physical advantages might otherwise make victory impossible. For those who lacked overwhelming strength or speed, the complexity of emotions that his enhanced perception revealed helped him understand how different people processed trauma while maintaining functionality under circumstances that might have destroyed less resilient individuals. The rehabilitation training program that was designed specifically for their trio's needs represented systematic approach to physical conditioning that differed qualitatively from combat-focused instruction they had received during basic training, as recovery from serious injuries required careful progression of exercises that rebuilt capability without risking additional damage through premature exertion or inadequate attention to healing processes that needed time and proper support to achieve complete restoration. The scientific precision that characterized their treatment plan reflected understanding of human physiology that enabled optimal recovery while preparing them for advanced training that would push their capabilities toward levels that basic Demon Slayer education had not been designed to achieve. Aioi Kanzaki's role as primary instructor for their rehabilitation activities demonstrated how non-combatant personnel contributed essential capabilities to Demon Slayer operations through specialized knowledge that supplemented frontline expertise with supporting services that enabled sustained effectiveness over extended campaigns against supernatural threats. Her medical background and practical experience with treating combat injuries created an educational environment that addressed individual limitations and strengths through personalized programs that maximized healing potential while establishing foundation for advanced training that would require physical conditioning beyond normal human parameters. The younger girls who assisted with rehabilitation activities brought enthusiasm and dedication that reminded Zenitsu of family relationships he had never experienced during childhood years, marked by abandonment and exploitation, as Sumi, Naho, and Kiyo's genuine care for patient welfare created a nurturing environment that addressed emotional needs alongside physical recovery requirements. Their presence served as a reminder that Demon Slayer operations existed to protect innocent people whose safety depended on maintaining capabilities that could meet any challenge regardless of personal cost or sacrifice required, while their cheerful support provided psychological comfort that enabled faster healing through positive social interaction. The total concentration breathing constant that formed cornerstone of advanced Demon Slayer conditioning required fundamental revision of autonomic processes that most people never consciously controlled, transforming respiration from unconscious biological function into deliberately managed system that could enhance all physical capabilities while providing foundation for accessing power that exceeded normal human limitations through systematic application of breathing techniques that had been refined through generations of practitioners. The mental discipline required to maintain enhanced breathing patterns during all daily activities, including sleep, created psychological framework that prepared consciousness for accessing abilities that conventional training could never develop or sustain. The initial difficulty that Zenitsu experienced with this advanced breathing technique reflected how comfortable he had become with intermediate skill levels that seemed adequate for missions he had completed successfully. Yet, his struggles also demonstrated that continued growth required willingness to abandon familiar patterns in favor of approaches that initially felt awkward or unnatural until repetition created new standards of normal function. The frustration that accompanied early training sessions provided motivation for persistence while teaching valuable lessons about how mastery required patience with gradual development rather than expecting immediate results that matched idealistic expectations about rapid improvement. The competitive dynamic that developed between himself, Tanjiro, and Inosuke during rehabilitation period created healthy rivalry that pushed each participant toward higher performance levels while building bonds of mutual respect and friendship that would prove essential for future operations where their lives would depend on absolute trust and coordination between partners whose capabilities complemented each other perfectly despite obvious personality differences and contrasting approaches to problem solving. Their different backgrounds and training experiences provided diverse perspectives that enriched collective understanding of Demon Slayer techniques while preventing any individual from becoming too rigid in approach to tactical challenges. The physical conditioning exercises that accompanied breathing training pushed bodies that had been damaged through combat toward new levels of strength and endurance that would be required for facing increasingly dangerous supernatural opponents, as recovery from serious injuries provided opportunity for rebuilding capabilities that exceeded previous performance through systematic attention to areas where improvement was possible and necessary. The repetitive drills that built muscle memory and coordination skills were conducted with precision that ensured proper form while preventing additional injury through premature advancement to more challenging activities that healing bodies were not yet prepared to handle safely. The massage therapy that was prescribed as part of comprehensive treatment program provided not only physical benefits through improved circulation and muscle relaxation, but psychological comfort through human contact that helped counteract isolation and emotional numbness that could result from traumatic encounters with supernatural evil that challenged basic assumptions about safety and predictability in human existence. The skilled hands that worked to relieve tension and promote healing created therapeutic connection that supplemented medical treatment with emotional support that enabled psychological recovery alongside physical restoration. The reflex training with canal that formed central component of their rehabilitation program introduced them to coordination challenges that tested reaction speed and spatial awareness, while building capabilities that would prove essential for facing opponents whose supernatural abilities enabled attacks that arrived faster than normal human reflexes could detect and counter without enhanced preparation. Her effortless superiority in these exercises demonstrated levels of capability that inspired continued effort while illustrating gaps that remained between their current abilities and standards that elite demon slayers achieved through years of dedicated training and practical experience. Kanao Suyuri's participation in their rehabilitation provided example of advanced technique application that showed what sustained dedication could achieve when natural talent was combined with systematic instruction and unwavering commitment to perfection in every aspect of Demon Slayer arts. As her apparent effortlessness in activities that challenged their maximum efforts served as inspiration, while revealing developmental targets that their training was designed to help them eventually achieve. Her coin-flipping decision-making process revealed psychological adaptation to trauma that had created functional responses to circumstances where normal emotional processing might have proven inadequate for maintaining operational effectiveness. The whole body training that concluded each day's rehabilitation activities functioned essentially as an elaborate game of tag that tested cardiovascular endurance, spatial reasoning, and tactical thinking under conditions that simulated combat stress without creating actual danger that might interfere with healing processes that required safe environment for optimal recovery. The challenge of evading capture by opponents whose speed and experience exceeded their current capabilities provided practical education in movement efficiency and strategic thinking that would prove valuable during actual demon encounters where superior positioning and intelligent use of terrain features could overcome disadvantages in raw physical capability. The consistent defeats that characterized their early attempts at whole-body training created psychological challenge that tested persistence and willingness to continue effort despite repeated failure, as accumulating evidence of inadequate performance could have undermined confidence and motivation if not properly contextualized as normal part of learning process, rather than indication of permanent inadequacy that no amount of practice could overcome. The patience required for accepting temporary failure while maintaining commitment to improvement provided psychological conditioning that would prove essential for Demon Slayer service, where initial encounters with new types of supernatural opponents often resulted in tactical defeats that required adaptation and creative problem-solving. Zenitsu's motivation during training sessions was significantly enhanced by presence of female staff members whose attention and approval provided emotional rewards that enabled sustained effort despite physical discomfort and psychological frustration that might otherwise have led to abandonment of challenging exercises in favor of more comfortable activities that would not have produced necessary improvements in capability and conditioning. His response to feminine encouragement revealed personality traits that could be channeled toward productive achievement when proper motivational frameworks were established and maintained through consistent positive reinforcement. The breakthrough moment when Tanjiro achieved success in defeating Kano during rehabilitation testing provided inspiration and validation that persistent effort could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, while demonstrating that individual achievement was possible, despite apparent permanent superiority of more experienced practitioners whose capabilities had initially seemed beyond reasonable expectation for reaching through normal training methods. His victory created collective motivation that enabled renewed commitment to challenging exercises that had previously seemed impossibly difficult. The total concentration breathing constant mastery that eventually emerged through sustained practice represented fundamental transformation in physiological function that enabled access to enhanced capabilities on a permanent basis rather than requiring specific techniques or conscious effort to achieve temporary improvements, as proper breathing patterns became automatic responses that operated continuously, regardless of activity or attention level. This achievement created foundation for advanced training that would require enhanced physical capabilities as baseline requirement, rather than special technique that needed conscious activation during combat situations. The lessons that Shinobu provided during their training period went beyond simple instruction in breathing techniques to encompass philosophical guidance about the psychological challenges that came with dedicating one's life to supernatural warfare, as her insights into the emotional costs of Demon Slayer service helped prepare them for decision-making scenarios where conventional moral frameworks might prove inadequate for circumstances that required choosing between competing values under extreme time pressure. Her wisdom about managing fear, anger, and despair would prove as important as physical conditioning for maintaining effectiveness during extended campaigns against enemies whose psychological warfare capabilities could undermine rational decision-making. The encouragement that Shinobu provided through personalized attention to individual needs and challenges created emotional support system that enabled psychological healing alongside physical recovery, as her gentle guidance helped process traumatic experiences while building confidence and determination that would sustain them through future encounters that might test their resolve as thoroughly as their technical abilities. Her method of providing motivation through combination of doubt and encouragement pushed each student toward maximum effort while maintaining psychological safety that enabled continued growth despite temporary setbacks. The bonds between team members that strengthened during rehabilitation period created emotional foundation for future partnership that would prove more resilient than simple professional cooperation, as shared struggle with challenging training requirements and mutual support during difficult recovery processes established trust and friendship that could sustain them through circumstances where individual survival would depend absolutely on team cohesion and unwavering commitment to protecting each other alongside innocent civilians whose welfare had become their primary responsibility. The completion of rehabilitation training that marked their transition from recovery patients to active demon slayers represented achievement that went beyond simple physical restoration to encompass psychological preparation for challenges that would test every aspect of their development while requiring integration of enhanced capabilities with tactical knowledge and moral framework that defined Demon Slayer service. The ceremony that acknowledged their successful recovery created a moment of celebration while providing foundation for whatever missions awaited them as full members of organization dedicated to protecting humanity from supernatural threats. The departure preparations that concluded their stay at Butterfly Mansion involved equipment inspection and briefings that ensured they understood their new responsibilities while providing final opportunities for guidance and encouragement from medical staff who had supervised their transformation, from injured survivors to capable operatives ready for advanced missions. The gratitude they expressed toward everyone who had contributed to their recovery reflected understanding that Demon Slayer service was supported by an extensive network of individuals whose contributions enabled frontline operations through specialized knowledge and dedicated service that extended far beyond direct combat activities. The journey toward their rendezvous with the Flame Hashira carried the trio through landscapes that seemed to exist in perpetual transition between traditional Japan and the rapidly modernizing world that Meiji-era reforms had unleashed upon society, as steam-powered trains cut through ancient valleys while telegraph wires stretched across rice fields that had been cultivated according to unchanged methods for countless generations. The mission parameters that would bring them into contact with Kyojuro Rengoku represented significant advancement in their operational responsibilities, as partnership with established Hashira indicated institutional recognition of their developing capabilities, while exposing them to combat situations that would test every aspect of their enhanced training against threats whose power exceeded anything their previous experience had prepared them to understand or survive. The railway station that served as meeting point for their convergence with the Flame Hashira bustled with activity that reflected Japan's enthusiastic embrace of Western technology and transportation methods, as passengers whose clothing ranged from traditional kimono to European-inspired fashion boarded mechanical marvels that could traverse distances in hours that would have required days of travel through conventional means. The cultural collision that characterized these transitional spaces created sensory environment that challenged Zenitsu's enhanced hearing abilities through overwhelming complexity of human voices, mechanical sounds, and general commotion that made detection of supernatural threats exponentially more difficult than wilderness. Environments where demonic presence would stand out clearly against relatively simple background patterns. The train itself represented convergence of human engineering achievement with supernatural threat potential that created operational environment unlike anything Demon Slayer training had traditionally addressed, as enclosed spaces and mechanical systems provided both tactical advantages and limitations that would require adaptation of conventional approaches to demon elimination, while maintaining safety standards that protected civilian passengers whose presence complicated every aspect of mission planning and execution. The Mugen train that would serve as battlefield for their encounter with upper-level demons stretched along platform like sleeping dragon whose steel and iron construction concealed vulnerabilities and defensive possibilities that could be exploited or turned against them, depending on supernatural capabilities they would face during nighttime hours when demonic activity reached peak intensity. The civilian passengers whose safety would become primary responsibility during any combat operations created additional complexity that transformed straightforward elimination mission into protection scenario where collateral damage would be unacceptable, regardless of tactical advantages that might be achieved through less discriminating approaches to supernatural warfare. The innocent families, business travelers, and ordinary citizens who viewed train journey as routine transportation rather than potential supernatural battleground represented everything that Demon Slayer service existed to protect while creating moral imperatives that would have an influence tactical decisions throughout whatever encounters awaited them during overnight travel through territory where demon activity had been reported with increasing frequency. Inosuke's first encounter with mechanized transportation provided entertainment that temporarily lightened psychological atmosphere while revealing how completely his wilderness upbringing had isolated him from technological developments that most contemporary Japanese people accepted as normal aspects of modern life. His description of the train as landmaster and his immediate impulse to challenge it to combat demonstrated personality traits that could prove both valuable and dangerous during missions that required discrimination between appropriate and inappropriate targets for aggressive action, as his instinctive response to unfamiliar phenomena involved direct confrontation that might create unnecessary complications in environments where subtlety and civilian protection were essential considerations. Zenitsu's attempts to provide rational explanation for train operations reflected his greater familiarity with modern developments, while creating opportunity for educational interaction that helped prepare Inosuke for functioning in civilized environments where social conventions and legal constraints required behavioral modifications that wilderness survival had never demanded. His role as cultural interpreter between traditional and modern worlds demonstrated how his urban background, despite its traumatic aspects, had provided knowledge and social awareness that complemented combat training with practical understanding of contemporary society and its operational requirements. The law enforcement complications that arose from Inosuke's aggressive interaction with railway property illustrated how demon slayer activities existed in legal grey area, where official government recognition was absent despite critical importance of their mission for public safety and national security. The police response to sword-carrying individuals whose behavior appeared threatening to civilian authorities created immediate practical problem, while highlighting ongoing challenge of maintaining operational security in increasingly regulated society where traditional weapons and unusual behavior attracted unwanted official attention that could compromise mission effectiveness. The explanation that Zenitsu provided regarding Demon Slayer Corps' unofficial status revealed institutional vulnerability that required careful management of public profile and government relations, as lack of formal recognition meant operations depended on avoiding conflicts with civilian authorities while maintaining effectiveness against supernatural threats that official institutions were unprepared to acknowledge or address through conventional law enforcement methods. This political dimension of their service added complexity to mission parameters that extended beyond simple combat effectiveness toward diplomatic considerations that could affect organizational survival and operational freedom. The boarding process that brought them into enclosed environment where escape options would be limited by mechanical constraints and civilian presence created psychological shift from outdoor missions where retreat remained possible toward commitment to sustained engagement regardless of threat levels or tactical disadvantages that might emerge during encounters with demons whose capabilities remained unknown, until direct contact provided intelligence that might arrive too late for strategic adjustment. The transition from platform to passenger compartment marked crossing of threshold beyond which conventional tactical assumptions about mobility and environmental control would require complete revision. The search for Kyojiro within trains' passenger compartments provided opportunity for observing civilian behavior patterns while practicing detection techniques in crowded environment where supernatural presence would need to be distinguished from normal human activity through subtle indicators that enhanced senses might reveal despite background noise and sensory complexity that could mask demonic signatures until threats became obvious through direct manifestation. The systematic examination of passenger cars created familiarity with trains' layout and population distribution that might prove tactically valuable during combat operations that would require rapid navigation through confined spaces The distinctive voice that announced itself through enthusiastic consumption of food provided auditory beacon that enabled location of Flame Hashira, whose presence had been detected through characteristic eating patterns and vocal expressions that reflected personality traits already famous throughout Demon Slayer core for their intensity and unwavering optimism. Kyojiro Rengoku's approach to nutrition demonstrated commitment to maintaining peak physical condition, while suggesting psychological framework that found joy and energy in activities that others might view as mere necessity or routine maintenance of bodily functions. The introduction that followed their discovery of the Flame Hashira provided first direct contact with Hashira-level operational philosophy and psychological approach to supernatural warfare that differed qualitatively from their own experiences with demon elimination, as Kyojiro's infectious enthusiasm and absolute confidence created inspirational atmosphere, while demonstrating how elite operatives maintained morale and effectiveness, despite constant exposure to horrors that could destroy less resilient minds through accumulated psychological trauma. His immediate acceptance of their request for training reflected commitment to developing next generation of demon slayers, while acknowledging that knowledge transfer was essential responsibility that came with elite status. The demon that appeared from opposite end of train during their initial meeting provided immediate practical demonstration of Kyojiro's combat capabilities, while illustrating threat levels that required constant vigilance during missions that brought them into territory where supernatural predation was active and ongoing. His swift elimination of this threat through efficient application of flame-breathing techniques demonstrated mastery that made complex tactical maneuvers appear effortless, while providing educational opportunity for observing Hashira-level performance under actual combat conditions rather than training scenarios that could simulate but never fully replicate real encounters with supernatural opponents. The philosophical discussions that began during their journey toward unknown destination revealed Kyojiro's approach to Demon Slayer service as calling that transcended mere occupation to encompass complete dedication to protecting innocent people through willing sacrifice of personal safety and conventional life goals that most individuals pursued for happiness and fulfillment. His teachings about maintaining strong heart, regardless of external circumstances, provided psychological foundation that would prove essential for surviving challenges that tested mental resilience as thoroughly as physical capability, while his unwavering belief in human potential created framework for understanding moral responsibilities that came with supernatural power. The sleep that eventually claimed all passengers as night deepened over moving train marked transition from conscious vigilance toward vulnerable state where supernatural attack could achieve maximum psychological impact through manipulation of dreams and unconscious mental processes that normal defensive techniques were inadequate to protect against comprehensive assault on consciousness itself. The gradual onset of altered awareness that characterized Enmu's blood demon art influence operated through mechanisms so subtle that detection required understanding of psychological manipulation techniques that most demon slayers lacked despite extensive combat training that addressed physical threats more effectively than mental warfare. The dream state that trapped Zenitsu within idealized romantic fantasy with Nezuko represented form of psychological warfare that targeted his deepest emotional needs and vulnerabilities, while creating mental prison whose appeal made conscious resistance extremely difficult despite rational understanding that experiences were artificially induced rather than authentic interactions with beloved person whose welfare had become central to his identity and motivation for Demon Slayer service. The peach orchard setting that provided backdrop for these false experiences carried symbolic associations with love, fertility, and domestic happiness that his orphaned childhood had never provided, while creating powerful emotional incentive for remaining within comfortable illusion rather than confronting harsh realities of supernatural combat. The perfection of his dream scenario reflected Enmu's sophisticated understanding of human psychology and individual personality analysis that enabled creation of customized psychological traps whose content was specifically designed to appeal to personal desires and emotional weaknesses that made escape through conscious will nearly impossible without external intervention or extraordinary mental discipline. The attention to detail in dream construction demonstrated how upper-level demons could combine supernatural power with intellectual capability that exceeded simple predatory behavior to encompass complex psychological manipulation that could neutralize human opponents without requiring direct physical confrontation. The darkness that characterized his subconscious mental landscape when Enmu's human accomplice attempted to destroy his spiritual core created protective environment where conscious personality traits could manifest defensive responses to invasion attempts that threatened fundamental aspects of identity and psychological integrity that defined individual existence. The appearance of his sleeping form within mental construct carrying gardening shears represented symbolic transformation of vulnerable state into aggressive defender whose territorial instincts would not permit unauthorized access to psychological spaces that contained most intimate thoughts and emotional connections. The violent response that he displayed toward intruder who had violated mental privacy revealed protective mechanisms that operated below conscious awareness, while demonstrating how deeply his connection to Nezuko had become integrated with core identity in ways that made any threat to her welfare trigger defensive reactions that transcended normal behavioral patterns. His declaration that only Nezuko was permitted within his subconscious territory reflected psychological boundaries that had been established through genuine emotional investment, while creating security measures that supernatural manipulation could not easily overcome, despite sophisticated technique for bypassing normal mental defense. The awakening that brought him back to conscious awareness of train environment and immediate supernatural threats provided opportunity for applying enhanced capabilities toward protection of other passengers whose vulnerability to dream manipulation had made them easy targets for predation that could have continued indefinitely without intervention from someone whose psychological defenses had proven adequate for resisting mental invasion. The transition from dream state to combat readiness required rapid integration of information about changed circumstances while maintaining tactical effectiveness despite disorientation that typically accompanied sudden awakening from induced sleep. The thunder-breathing technique that he employed for freeing trapped passengers demonstrated how individual expertise could be adapted for rescue operations that required precision and speed rather than simple elimination of supernatural opponents, as his ability to sever dream connections without harming innocent people reflected mastery that went beyond combat applications toward protective services that exemplified highest ideals of Demon Slayer mission. The six-fold application of first form thunderclap and flash created cascade effect that liberated multiple victims simultaneously while preventing psychological damage that might have resulted from traumatic awakening without proper preparation. The protection of Nezuko that he provided during subsequent combat operations against train-bound demon represented culmination of personal motivation that had driven his development from frightened youth toward capable warrior whose primary purpose involved safeguarding someone whose welfare had become more important than his own survival or advancement within organizational hierarchy. His declaration of protective intent created clear mission parameters, while demonstrating how individual relationships could provide emotional foundation for exceptional performance under circumstances that tested commitment to principles that transcended self-interest. The coordination with Nezuko during defense of passenger cars illustrated how their partnership could achieve tactical effectiveness that exceeded some of individual capabilities, as her demonic abilities complemented his thunder-breathing techniques in ways that created comprehensive, defensive coverage, while maintaining distinction between protective violence and predatory aggression that characterized authentic demon behavior. Their cooperation demonstrated possibility for human-demon alliance that challenged conventional doctrine while proving effectiveness through practical results that saved innocent lives. The aftermath of train derailment that resulted from their collective combat efforts against Enmu created emergency situation where rescue operations became as important as supernatural threat elimination, while Kyojiro's sacrifice during subsequent encounter with Upper Moon Demon provided tragic education in costs associated with Demon Slayer service at highest levels of operational responsibility. The loss of their first Hashira mentor created emotional impact that would influence their understanding of mortality and commitment required for continued service, despite obvious dangers that claimed lives of even most capable warriors. The sunrise that concluded their train mission brought with it mixture of victory and loss that characterized Demon Slayer operations, where success was measured not only through elimination of supernatural threats but through preservation of innocent life and protection of values that made human civilization worth defending against forces that sought its destruction. The experience had tested every aspect of their training while providing practical education in upper-level combat that would prepare them for increasingly dangerous missions that awaited as their capabilities and responsibilities continued to expand within organizational hierarchy dedicated to eternal vigilance against supernatural evil. The months that followed Kyojiro's tragic sacrifice during the Mugen train incident stretched like a meditation on loss and determination, as the trio's intensive training at Butterfly Mansion was punctuated by individual missions that tested their developing capabilities, while providing practical experience with demon elimination in circumstances that lacked the supportive presence of Hashira guidance or team coordination that had characterized their most successful operations. The solitary nature of these assignments created opportunities for personal growth and self-reliance, while forcing each young demon slayer to confront psychological challenges that group dynamics had previously helped them manage through mutual encouragement and shared responsibility for mission outcomes that now rested entirely upon individual judgment and capability. Zenitsu's evolution during these months of independent service reflected fundamental transformation from the terrified youth who had required constant reassurance and protection towards someone whose competence and reliability had begun attracting attention from core leadership as evidence of exceptional potential that might eventually warrant advancement toward greater responsibilities within organizational hierarchy. His solo missions had proven that unconscious combat abilities could be accessed with increasing frequency and control, while his enhanced hearing provided tactical advantages that enabled mission success rates exceeding statistical averages for demon slayers of equivalent experience and training background, creating reputation that would prove both beneficial and burdensome, as expectations for continued exceptional performance grew alongside his demonstrated capabilities. The sound Hashira Tengen Uzui, whose arrival at Butterfly Mansion announced itself through flamboyant presence and theatrical mannerisms that seemed designed to command attention while establishing dominance through sheer force of personality, represented approach to Demon Slayer service that differed dramatically from the quiet dedication and humble effectiveness that characterized their own developing professional identities. His obvious confidence and casual assumption of authority over operational decisions reflected Hashira status, while demonstrating how elite rank could be expressed through leadership styles that ranged from Kyojiro's inspiring enthusiasm to approaches that prioritized efficiency and results over emotional considerations that might interfere with tactical effectiveness under circumstances where sentiment could prove fatal. The mission parameters that Tengen presented involved infiltration of Yoshiwara Entertainment District, where his 3 wives had disappeared during intelligence gathering operations that had been designed to identify supernatural threats, operating within an environment that combined legitimate business activities with criminal enterprises, and social dynamics that could provide perfect camouflage for demonic predation. The complexity of this assignment exceeded anything their previous experience had addressed, requiring skills in deception, social interaction, and urban operations that wilderness-focused training had not specifically prepared them to handle effectively without significant adaptation and creative problem-solving, under circumstances where mistakes could compromise not only mission success but innocent lives. The revelation that Tengen possessed 3 wives created immediate psychological crisis for Zenitsu, whose romantic disappointments and desperate need for emotional connection made the sound Hashira's domestic success seem like personal affront to justice and natural order. As someone whose flamboyant arrogance and obvious vanity had achieved relationship satisfaction that seemed impossible for someone whose dedication and genuine caring had been repeatedly rejected or exploited by potential partners. His explosive reaction to this information reflected deeper insecurities about personal worth and attractiveness that Demon Slayer service had helped address through professional competence, but had not completely resolved through external validation of capabilities that remained separate from romantic success. The disguise operation that would enable their infiltration of entertainment district establishments required transformation of their appearances and personas toward feminine presentations that could pass casual inspection while providing access to social environments where male presence would be immediately suspicious and potentially dangerous if their true identities were discovered by supernatural opponents whose intelligence networks might extend throughout legitimate business operations. The challenge of maintaining convincing feminine behavior patterns while remaining prepared for combat operations that might require immediate transition from social deception to deadly effectiveness created psychological complexity that tested adaptability and performance capabilities under conditions that formal training had never addressed through simulation or theoretical instruction. Tengen's success in placing Tanjiro within Tokito House through application of his considerable charm and social manipulation skills demonstrated how Demon Slayer operations could require diverse capabilities that extended far beyond combat effectiveness toward diplomatic and social competencies that enabled access to restricted environments where supernatural threats might be operating with sufficient camouflage to avoid detection through conventional surveillance methods. His obvious comfort with deception and roleplay reflected experience with covert operations that had developed abilities complementing his exceptional combat skills while creating tactical options unavailable to operatives whose training focused exclusively on direct confrontation with supernatural opponents. The assignment of Inosuke to establishment that could accommodate his personality traits while providing operational base for intelligence gathering activities reflected strategic thinking that matched individual capabilities with mission requirements in ways that maximized effectiveness while minimizing risks associated with behavioral inconsistencies that might compromise cover identities. His placement required careful management of his aggressive tendencies while utilizing his enhanced physical capabilities for protection of innocent civilians, who might become targets if supernatural threats identified Demon Slayer presence within their operational territory. Zenitsu's assignment to Kyogoku House placed him within establishment whose atmosphere and clientele created sensory environment that challenged his enhanced hearing abilities while providing optimal conditions for detecting by day supernatural presence that might be concealed within normal business operations through sophisticated camouflage techniques that relied on human psychological patterns and social expectations to avoid suspicion. His enhanced auditory perception would prove crucial for mission success while creating emotional burden as constant awareness of human suffering and exploitation challenged his psychological resilience in ways that direct combat with obvious evil never could. The mourning that characterized Kyogoku House atmosphere due to manager's recent death created operational challenges, while providing cover for unusual behavior that might otherwise have attracted suspicious attention from staff or clientele whose vigilance regarding newcomers was heightened by recent tragedy and associated security concerns. The grief and uncertainty that pervaded establishment created opportunities for information gathering while requiring careful navigation of social dynamics that could provide crucial intelligence or create dangerous exposure depending on how skillfully emotional currents were read and managed during interactions with potentially vulnerable sources. The sobbing that drew Zenitsu's attention through his enhanced hearing capabilities provided first concrete lead towards supernatural activity while creating moral imperative for immediate intervention despite potential compromise of cover identity that such action might create if circumstances required abandoning deception in favor of protective response to obvious distress. His discovery of devastated room and traumatized girl created immediate tactical decision about priorities that would influence entire mission trajectory while testing commitment to protecting innocent people versus maintaining operational security that might enable broader success against supernatural threats. The appearance of Wara Bahim, whose true identity as Upper Moon 6 remained concealed beneath convincing human disguise, represented first direct encounter with elite demon whose capabilities exceeded anything their previous experience had prepared them to face, while her blood demon art abilities enabled perfect camouflage within human society that had prevented detection despite extended residence within Entertainment District. Her immediate recognition that Zenitsu was not ordinary civilian demonstrated intelligence and perceptive abilities that made maintaining cover identity impossible despite careful preparation and training in deceptive techniques. The confrontation that developed when Zenitsu intervened to protect abused girl revealed Daki's casual cruelty and complete indifference to human suffering, while demonstrating how demonic transformation had eliminated empathy, moral constraints that might have limited predatory behavior, even among criminals or antisocial individuals whose human nature remained intact. Her treatment of the crying girl as disposable property illustrated fundamental difference between human evil that retained possibility for redemption and supernatural corruption that had permanently severed connections to moral framework that defined civilized behavior. The physical assault that rendered Zenitsu unconscious represented tactical failure of cover identity, while providing Daki with opportunity to eliminate potential threat through methods that would not attract unwanted attention from authorities or other residents whose suspicions might complicate her continued operations within establishment. His inability to defend himself effectively while maintaining disguise created vulnerability that would have proven fatal if mission parameters had not included backup support from more experienced operative whose tactical awareness enabled intervention before irreversible harm could be. inflicted. The imprisonment within Obi dimension that trapped multiple victims, including captured demon slayers and innocent civilians, demonstrated blood demon art capabilities that exceeded simple physical enhancement to encompass spatial manipulation that could remove threats from normal reality while providing convenient storage for potential meals, whose consumption could be delayed according to tactical convenience or personal preference. The discovery of this supernatural prison revealed scope of predation that had been occurring within Entertainment District, while creating rescue scenario that required coordinated assault on upper-level demon whose power exceeded anything their individual capabilities could overcome through conventional approaches. The reunion with Inosuke within Obi Dimension created opportunity for coordinated response that utilized their complementary abilities while addressing immediate threats to captive civilians whose survival depended on swift action before Daki's attention returned to stored victims whose continued existence represented vulnerability that she might eliminate to prevent complications during anticipated combat with demon slayers whose presence she had detected. Their cooperation within confined space required adaptation of combat techniques toward rescue operations, while maintaining effectiveness against supernatural defenses that protected Demon's dimensional storage system. The battle that developed between Demon Slayers and Upper Moon 6 represented escalation to threat levels that tested every aspect of their enhanced training, while requiring tactical coordination that maximized individual strengths through strategic combination of different breathing techniques and specialized capabilities. The blood demon art attacks that Daki deployed created environmental hazards while demonstrating regenerative abilities and supernatural speed that made conventional elimination strategies inadequate without creative adaptation of standard approaches to demon combat that had proven effective against less powerful opponents. The revelation of Gyutaro's presence within Daki's body transformed tactical situation from challenging but manageable combat against single opponent toward unprecedented encounter with dual demon system whose combined capabilities exceeded anything Demon Slayer doctrine had prepared them to face through individual or team efforts. His emergence created immediate threat assessment crisis, while providing crucial intelligence about Upper Moon hierarchy and organizational structure that revealed how elite demons could operate through partnerships that multiplied individual strengths while covering tactical weaknesses that might have made single opponents vulnerable to coordinated human assault. The combined assault strategy that emerged through desperate analysis of tactical requirements recognized that simultaneous decapitation of both demons would be necessary for achieving permanent elimination, as their connected existence meant that destroying one while leaving other intact would result in regeneration and renewed combat effectiveness that could prove impossible to overcome during extended engagement. This understanding created operational requirement for perfect coordination between team members whose individual capabilities would need to be focused toward achieving precisely timed attacks that overcame supernatural defenses while maintaining tactical effectiveness despite psychological pressure and physical exhaustion. The protection of civilian areas during urban combat operations required constant attention to collateral damage prevention, while maintaining combat effectiveness against opponents whose blood demon arts created widespread destruction that threatened innocent people whose presence within combat zone was unavoidable due to Entertainment District's population, density, and architectural constraints that prevented evacuation or isolation of battlefield from surrounding community. The moral imperative to minimize civilian casualties created tactical limitations, while providing motivation for exceptional performance that transcended normal human limitations through determination to fulfill protective responsibilities, regardless of personal cost. The individual combat assignments that developed through tactical necessity placed each demon slayer in position where personal capabilities would be tested against specific aspects of dual demon threat system, as Zenitsu's speed and precision were optimally suited for engaging Daki, while other team members focused their efforts against Jutaro, whose different fighting style and blood demon art capabilities required alternative approaches to achieving successful elimination. This specialization enabled maximum efficiency while creating mutual dependency that required absolute trust and coordination between partners whose survival depended on collective success rather than individual achievement. The thunder-breathing techniques that Zenitsu deployed against Daki represented culmination of his training evolution from single-form specialist toward more versatile combatant whose unconscious abilities could be accessed with increasing reliability during high-stress combat situations. His strikes achieved levels of speed and precision that enabled successful decapitation despite upper moon regenerative capabilities and defensive techniques that had previously made permanent damage impossible through conventional demon slayer attacks, while his coordination with team members created tactical synergy that overcame supernatural advantages through perfectly executed simultaneous assault. The victory that resulted from their coordinated effort against Upper Moon 6 represented unprecedented achievement for demon slayers of their experience level, while providing practical validation of enhanced training methods and tactical approaches that had been developed through analysis of previous encounters with elite supernatural opponents. The successful elimination of demons, whose power had claimed lives of multiple Hashira throughout core history, demonstrated that properly coordinated team efforts could overcome individual limitations while achieving results that exceeded reasonable expectations based on conventional assessment of capabilities and experience levels. The aftermath of Entertainment District Mission created opportunities for reflection on lessons learned while beginning recovery process that would be necessary for returning to operational readiness after combat that had pushed physical and psychological capabilities toward absolute limits of human endurance and tactical effectiveness. The knowledge gained through direct experience with upper moon level threats would influence future training and mission preparation while providing foundation for continued development toward roles of greater responsibility within organizational hierarchy, dedicated to protecting human civilization from supernatural predation that threatened essential values and individual lives that gave meaning to demon slayer sacrifice and dedication. The Hashira training period that would serve as preparation for humanity's final confrontation with Muzan and his remaining forces began with systematic evaluation of every surviving demon slayer's capabilities while implementing conditioning programs that pushed human potential toward absolute limits through methods that had been refined through generations of combat experience against supernatural opponents whose power exceeded normal parameters of possibility and survival. The collective wisdom that guided these preparations reflected understanding that conventional training approaches would prove inadequate for battles that would determine whether human civilization could survive systematic elimination by creatures whose abilities had been enhanced through centuries of consuming human flesh while developing tactical sophistication that exceeded simple predatory behavior to encompass strategic warfare against organized resistance. The news that reached Zenitsu during this intensive preparation period struck him with psychological impact that transcended simple grief to encompass fundamental challenge to his understanding of loyalty, honor, and the moral framework that had guided his development from frightened youth toward competent demon slayer whose capabilities had earned respect within organizational hierarchy. The intelligence regarding Kaigaku's transformation into demon represented betrayal of everything that thunder-breathing tradition embodied, while creating personal crisis that forced confrontation with questions about whether their shared training under Jigoro's guidance had been sufficient to prevent corruption of someone whose potential had been recognized and cultivated through years of patient instruction and moral guidance that should have created unbreakable commitment to protecting innocent people from supernatural predation. The revelation of Jigoro's response to news of his former student's demonification demonstrated how completely the elderly master understood responsibility and shame that came with failing to instill proper moral foundation in someone whose abilities could be turned toward evil purposes that violated fundamental principles of thunder-breathing discipline and demon slayer service. The seppuku that Jigoro performed as atonement for Kaigaku's betrayal represented traditional approach to accepting consequences for educational failures that had permitted supernatural corruption of trusted disciple whose transformation endangered innocent people while dishonoring centuries of tradition that had been preserved through sacrifice and dedication of countless practitioners who had maintained moral integrity despite temptations and pressures that could have led them toward paths of personal advancement at expense of protective responsibilities. The solitary nature of Jigoro's death created additional psychological burden for Zenitsu, whose absence during his master's final moments meant that traditional assistance during honorable suicide had not been available, leaving elderly swordsmen to face death alone, while contemplating failure that had enabled demonic corruption of student, whose potential had justified years of investment and emotional attachment that made betrayal personally devastating, as well as professionally catastrophic. The knowledge that someone he loved had died in agony and isolation, while accepting responsibility for circumstances that extended beyond individual control, created guilt and regret that threatened to undermine psychological stability necessary for continued demon slayer service during period when maximum effectiveness would be required for survival of humanity itself. The rage that consumed Zenitsu upon learning details of his master's death and the circumstances that had precipitated such drastic response reflected depths of emotion that had been building throughout years of admiration and gratitude toward man whose intervention had transformed desperate circumstances into opportunities for growth and meaning, that had given direction to existence that might otherwise have ended in exploitation and abandonment. The fury that accompanied his grief was directed not only toward Kaigaku, whose choices had created situation requiring such extreme response, but toward circumstances that had prevented him from providing support and companionship that might have made Jigoro's final moments less painful and isolated than solitary death that had been endured without comfort or assistance that honor and affection demanded. The philosophical crisis that accompanied personal grief involved questions about whether dedication and training were sufficient to prevent corruption when individuals possessed capabilities that could be enhanced through demonic transformation, or whether moral framework and emotional bonds that seemed unbreakable could be overcome by supernatural influence that offered power and status at expense of human connection and protective responsibilities. The evidence of Kaigaku's betrayal suggested that years of shared training and mutual respect could be abandoned when circumstances offered personal advancement that required severing ties to human community and accepting identity as predator rather than protector of innocent people, whose welfare should have remained primary concern regardless of individual ambition or external pressure. The implications of having former training partner transformed into supernatural enemy created tactical challenges alongside emotional trauma, as intimate knowledge of thunder-breathing techniques and fighting patterns would provide Kaigaku with strategic advantages that normal demons lacked when facing opponents whose capabilities and weaknesses were familiar through years of shared practice and competitive interaction. The prospect of combat against someone whose abilities had been developed through identical training methods while being enhanced through demonic transformation created a scenario where victory would require not only technical superiority, but psychological resilience that could overcome emotional attachments and personal history that might interfere with necessary tactical decisions during life or death combat. The preparation for final battle that continued, despite personal crisis, required compartmentalization of grief and anger in ways that enabled continued focus on collective objectives while preventing emotional turmoil from compromising effectiveness during training exercises that pushed physical and mental capabilities toward levels that would be required for survival against opponents whose power exceeded anything previous encounters had demanded. The Hashira training regimen that all surviving demon slayers were required to complete represented systematic approach to enhancing capabilities through methods that had proven effective for developing elite operatives whose individual effectiveness could influence outcomes of battles where numerical disadvantages made individual excellence crucial for collective survival. The descent into Infinity Castle that marked beginning of final confrontation with Muzan and his remaining forces created tactical situation where all previous experience and training would be tested against opponents whose capabilities represented pinnacle of demonic evolution and supernatural warfare, while architectural impossibilities and spatial manipulation created environmental challenges that exceeded anything conventional military training could have addressed through standard approaches to navigation and tactical positioning. The separation that immediately followed their entry into Dimensional Fortress ensured that individual capabilities would determine survival outcomes while preventing coordination and mutual support that had characterized their most successful operations throughout their Demon Slayer careers. The encounter with Kaigaku within maze-like structure of Supernatural Fortress represented convergence of personal trauma with professional obligation, as Zenitsu found himself facing opponent whose transformation had destroyed everything that their shared training under Jigero's guidance should have created in terms of loyalty, honor, and commitment to protecting innocent people from supernatural predation that threatened human civilization. The recognition that occurred between former training partners carried weight of years of competition, mutual respect, and shared experience that had been perverted through demonic corruption into confrontation where one would survive while other would face permanent elimination through combat that would test not only technical abilities but emotional resilience and moral clarity. The mockery that Kaigaku directed toward his former junior reflected psychological changes that demonic transformation had produced alongside enhancement of physical capabilities, as supernatural corruption had eliminated empathy and emotional connection, while amplifying negative personality traits that had always created tension between training partners whose different approaches to strength and achievement had made genuine friendship impossible, despite years of coexistence under Jigoro's supervision. His contemptuous dismissal of Zenitsu's single-form specialization demonstrated how completely he had abandoned understanding of thunder-breathing philosophy that emphasized perfection through dedicated focus rather than superficial competence across broad range of techniques that lacked depth and mastery necessary for achieving true excellence. The revelation that Kaigaku had been elevated to Upper Moon 6 status provided crucial intelligence about Muzan's organizational structure while creating immediate tactical challenge, as his enhanced abilities represented combination of familiar techniques with supernatural augmentation that made conventional countermeasures inadequate for achieving reliable combat effectiveness. His mastery of multiple thunder breathing, forms that had been beyond Zenitsu's capabilities during their shared training period, now represented deadly arsenal, whose application, through demonic enhancement, created attack patterns that could overwhelm defenses based on assuming normal human limitations and conventional tactical approaches to demon elimination. The philosophical confrontation that accompanied physical combat involved fundamental disagreement about values and priorities that defined meaningful existence. As Kaigaku's justification for his transformation centered on seeking recognition and acceptance from sources of power regardless of moral cost, while Zenitsu's opposition represented commitment to principles that transcended personal advancement in favor of protecting others whose welfare had become more important than individual survival or achievement. This ideological conflict provided emotional foundation for combat that would determine not only individual survival, but validation of competing worldviews about strength, honor, and responsibility that gave meaning to Demon Slayer service. The accusation that Kaigaku leveled regarding Jigoro's death reflected attempt to shift responsibility for consequences of his betrayal towards circumstances and other people, rather than accepting accountability for choices that had made a traditional response inevitable given morale framework that governed thunder-breathing tradition and Demon Slayer principles. His casual dismissal of their former master's suffering demonstrated how completely demonic transformation had eliminated capacity for empathy and emotional connection, while enabling psychological defense mechanisms that prevented recognition of harm his decisions had inflicted on someone whose care and investment had justified years of patience and instruction despite personality difficulties that had made teaching relationship challenging and often frustrating. The fury that Zenitsu felt upon hearing Kaigaku's disrespectful comments about Jigoro's solitary death provided motivational energy that transcended normal human limitations, while creating emotional foundation for accessing enhanced capabilities that had been developing through years of training and practical experience with supernatural combat. The rage that consumed him represented not only personal grief, but moral outrage at betrayal of values that gave meaning to sacrifice and dedication that Demon Slayer service demanded from individuals who chose protecting others over personal safety and conventional definitions of success and happiness. The seventh form that Zenitsu had developed through years of contemplating thunder-breathing principles and his relationship with Kaigaku represented culmination of innovative thinking that could extend traditional techniques beyond established parameters through creative application of fundamental principles that governed lightning-based combat arts. The technique that he unleashed during their final confrontation embodied both technical mastery and emotional investment in proving that dedication and heart could overcome apparent advantages in raw power and supernatural enhancement when properly focused and applied with complete commitment to moral objectives that transcended individual welfare. The speed that characterized his decisive attack achieved levels that exceeded even enhanced demon perception and reflexes, as perfect execution of self-created technique combined with emotional intensity and years of accumulated skill to produce results that violated normal expectations about what human capability could achieve through training and firm determination alone. The decapitation that concluded their confrontation represented not only tactical victory but vindication of philosophical approach that emphasized depth over breadth while validating choices that had seemed limiting compared to more comprehensive approaches to skill development and combat. Effectiveness. The spiritual encounter with Jigoro that occurred during Zenitsu's near-death experience following combat with Kaigaku provided emotional resolution and validation that transcended physical survival to encompass deeper understanding of relationship between teacher and student that had shaped his development despite external circumstances that had prevented proper expression of gratitude and affection. The red spider lily field that served as backdrop for their meeting carried symbolic significance related to death and transformation, while creating peaceful environment where communication could occur without constraints of physical reality or time pressure that had characterized their earthly relationship. The tears that Jigoro shed while declaring Zenitsu as his pride and joy provided emotional healing that addressed years of self-doubt and uncertainty about worthiness and capability that had persisted despite evidence of competence and dedication through successful missions and growing reputation within Demon Slayer hierarchy. The validation that came from final approval of beloved mentor created psychological foundation for continued service, while resolving internal conflicts about adequacy and meaning that had influenced his development throughout training, period and early career as active Demon Slayer. The survival that resulted from Yushiro's intervention demonstrated how alliances between unlikely partners could provide crucial support during moments when individual resources proved inadequate for overcoming circumstances that exceeded normal human capacity to survive through personal effort alone. His rescue from consequences of overextension during combat with Upper Moon Demon provided opportunity for recovery and continued participation in final battle, while illustrating importance of relationships and mutual support that extended beyond formal organizational structure to encompass broader community of individuals committed to protecting innocent people from supernatural predation. The medical attention that he received during recovery period provided necessary healing while enabling preparation for final stages of confrontation with Muzan himself, as his individual victory against Kaigaku had contributed to weakening of enemy leadership structure, while proving that proper training and moral foundation could overcome supernatural advantages when applied with sufficient skill and determination. The knowledge that his former training partner had been permanently eliminated through techniques that honored thunder-breathing tradition created closure that enabled focus on collective objectives rather than personal trauma that might have interfered with tactical effectiveness during ultimate confrontation between humanity and forces of supernatural evil. The final battle that awaited would test everything he had learned through years of training, combat experience, and personal growth, while requiring coordination with surviving demon slayers, whose collective efforts would determine whether human civilization could survive systematic attempt at extinction by creatures whose power had been accumulated through centuries of predation and strategic development. The preparation that concluded his individual arc within broader narrative represented transformation from frightened youth, whose potential had been recognized by caring mentor toward warrior whose capabilities and dedication justified trust and investment that had been provided despite obvious challenges and psychological barriers that had made success uncertain during early stages of education and development. The dimensional fortress that housed humanity's final confrontation with the progenitor of all demons stretched through impossible geometries that defied architectural logic, while creating battlefield conditions where conventional, tactical assumptions about movement, positioning, and environmental control became meaningless obstacles to effective combat coordination between demon slayers whose survival would depend on adapting to circumstances that no amount of training could have adequately prepared them to navigate successfully. The infinity castle that Nakime's blood demon art had constructed as Muzan's ultimate stronghold represented culmination of centuries of supernatural warfare planning, while demonstrating how elite demons could manipulate reality itself to create advantages that human opponents would need to overcome through superior technique, unwavering determination, and tactical innovation that transcended established methods for achieving victory against impossible odds. The reunion of surviving demon slayers within shifting corridors of supernatural fortress marked convergence of individual battles that had weakened Muzan's organizational structure while testing each warrior's capabilities against upper moon opponents whose elimination had been necessary, preliminary step toward confronting demon progenitor whose power exceeded anything their collective experience had encountered during years of service, dedicated to protecting innocent people from supernatural predation. The Hashira, whose sacrifice and tactical excellence had enabled survival of younger operatives, created legacy of inspiration and strategic intelligence that would prove crucial for maintaining effectiveness during final engagement where individual excellence would need to be coordinated into collective effort capable of overcoming centuries of accumulated demonic power and tactical sophistication. The appearance of Muzan himself within Dimensional Battleground created immediate atmospheric change that reflected presence of supernatural entity whose capabilities had shaped demon hierarchy while establishing parameters for centuries of conflict between human and monster that had claimed countless lives on both sides of struggle for survival and dominance. His physical manifestation combined elegant appearance with underlying malevolence that made visual contact psychologically disturbing, while his casual confidence suggested awareness of advantages that made human victory seem impossibly optimistic, despite quality of opposition that had assembled to challenge his continued existence and threat to human civilization that his predatory nature represented. The coordinated assault that began final confrontation required perfect synchronization between demon slayers whose different breathing techniques and specialized capabilities needed to be integrated into tactical approach that could overcome Muzan's defensive abilities while preventing him from utilizing superior speed and strength to eliminate individual opponents before collective effort could achieve decisive results. The flower-breathing and thunder-breathing techniques that Kanao and Zenitsu deployed in their initial attacks represented combination of precision and power that demonstrated how diverse training backgrounds could create complementary advantages when properly coordinated under circumstances where individual excellence served collective objectives rather than personal advancement or recognition. The lightning-fast strikes that Zenitsu contributed to their combined offensive demonstrated culmination of his development from unconscious sleep fighter toward warrior who could access enhanced capabilities during conscious combat states. As his thunder-breathing first form achieved levels of speed and precision that made his attacks nearly impossible to perceive or counter, despite Muzan's supernatural reflexes and centuries of combat experience against human opponents. The coordination between his electrical attacks and other demon slayers' techniques created tactical synergy that multiplied individual effectiveness while maintaining constant pressure that prevented their primary target from adapting defensive strategies or launching counteroffensives that could have eliminated team members through focused aggression. The environmental challenges that accompanied battle within shifting dimensional space required constant adaptation to changing floor plans, gravity orientations, and spatial relationships that could transform tactical advantages into deadly traps without warning or predictable pattern. that might have enabled strategic planning based on anticipated conditions. The blood demon art manipulation of architectural elements created additional hazards while demonstrating how completely supernatural opponents could control battlefield conditions in ways that favored their enhanced abilities while creating obstacles that human combatants needed to overcome through superior technique and tactical innovation, rather than relying on environmental advantages that conventional warfare typically provided. The psychological warfare that Muzan deployed alongside physical attacks involved attempts to undermine morale and tactical coordination through verbal assaults on individual motivation and collective unity that had enabled demon slayers to maintain effectiveness despite overwhelming odds and obvious advantages that supernatural opponents possessed through enhanced strength, speed, and regenerative capabilities. His casual dismissal of their chances for survival reflected both genuine assessment of power, disparity, and strategic attempt to create doubt and fear that could compromise combat performance during moments when hesitation or reduced effectiveness could prove immediately fatal. The endurance that characterized extended combat against opponent whose regenerative abilities made conventional damage largely meaningless required sustained application of technique and energy over periods that exceeded normal human capacity for maintaining peak performance, while accumulated fatigue created vulnerabilities that Muzan could exploit through tactical patience and strategic conservation of resources that his supernatural nature enabled him to maintain indefinitely. The physical exhaustion that began affecting Demon Slayer effectiveness created tactical crisis, where individual limitations threatened collective success, while time pressure increased as their window for achieving victory narrowed with each passing moment. The sacrifice that Zenitsu made during crucial phases of battle involved accepting injuries and tactical disadvantages that protected other team members while maintaining offensive pressure that prevented Muzan from focusing devastating attacks against single targets, whose elimination would have undermined collective capability beyond recovery. His willingness to absorb punishment while continuing attacks demonstrated commitment to protective principles that transcended self-preservation instincts, while enabling tactical coordination that kept their primary opponent from achieving decisive advantages through elimination of key personnel whose specialized capabilities were essential for maintaining combat effectiveness. The thunder-breathing techniques that he continued deploying despite accumulated damage and physical exhaustion represented triumph of determination over limitation, as his commitment to mission success enabled access to capabilities that normal circumstances would have made impossible to sustain through conscious effort alone. The seventh form that he had perfected through years of contemplation and practice achieved results that contributed significantly to collective damage being inflicted, while demonstrating how individual excellence could serve broader objectives when properly integrated with team coordination and mutual support that enabled sustained effectiveness against impossible odds. The recognition that his individual capabilities were approaching absolute limits while battle continued without clear resolution created psychological challenge that tested commitment to collective success against natural survival, instincts that demanded retreat or self-preservation responses that could have compromised mission effectiveness. The decision to continue fighting despite obvious risks reflected maturation from self-focused youth toward warrior, whose identity had become completely integrated with protective responsibilities that gave meaning to sacrifice and suffering that Demon Slayer service inevitably demanded from individuals who chose dedication over personal safety. The coordination with Tanjiro during final phases of combat demonstrated evolution of their partnership from mutual support between friends toward tactical integration between specialists whose complementary abilities created collective effectiveness that exceeded some of individual capabilities, while maintaining emotional bonds that provided psychological strength during moments when purely technical considerations might have been inadequate for sustaining effort required for achieving ultimate victory. Their mutual protection and coordinated attacks represented culmination of relationship that had been forged through shared danger and developed through trust that enabled absolute reliance on partner whose welfare had become as important as individual survival. The sun-breathing techniques that Tanjiro deployed during climactic moments of battle provided tactical breakthrough that enabled decisive assault, while Zenitsu's thunder breathing provided essential support that prevented Muzan from countering or escaping through superior speed and tactical flexibility that had characterized his defensive strategies throughout extended engagement. The perfect coordination between different breathing styles demonstrated how Demon Slayer training traditions could be integrated into approaches that achieved results exceeding what any individual technique could have accomplished through isolated application, regardless of mastery level or enhancement through supernatural factors. The critical moment when Zenitsu's interception of attack intended for Tanjiro enabled continuation of sun-breathing offensive that would prove decisive for achieving final victory represented ultimate expression of protective instincts that had motivated his development from frightened youth toward capable warrior whose primary purpose involved safeguarding others regardless of personal cost. His willing acceptance of injury that could have been avoided through self-preservation enabled tactical success that would determine outcome of battle while demonstrating how individual sacrifice could serve collective objectives that transcended personal welfare or survival considerations. The medical attention that he received while Tanjiro continued final assault against weakened Muzan provided opportunity for witnessing culmination of struggle that had defined their lives, while beginning recovery process that would be necessary for survival and continued service if humanity achieved victory against supernatural enemy whose elimination would transform world conditions in ways that required new approaches to meaning and purpose for individuals whose identities had been shaped through constant warfare against demonic threats. His declaration of love for Nezuko while believing himself to be dying reflected honest expression of emotions that had been building throughout their partnership, while providing psychological completion of romantic aspirations that had motivated much of his personal development. The temporary transformation of Tanjiro into demon represented final test of bonds and commitment that had been forged through years of shared experience and mutual support, as Zenitsu's immediate response involved desperate attempts to restore friends' humanity while preventing harm to Nezuko, whose welfare had become central to both their identities and sense of purpose. His pleas for rational thought and recognition of human connections demonstrated faith in relationships that could overcome supernatural corruption, while reflecting understanding that individual identity was maintained through emotional bonds rather than purely physical or mental characteristics. The restoration of Tanjiro's humanity through medicine that reversed demonic transformation provided resolution that enabled celebration of collective victory, while beginning transition toward peacetime existence that would require fundamental revision of purpose and identity for individuals whose entire adult development had occurred within context of supernatural warfare against enemies whose elimination would create entirely different conditions for human civilization. The success that they had achieved through coordinated effort and mutual sacrifice, validated training methods, and moral framework that had guided Demon Slayer's service while providing foundation for whatever future awaited in a world where demonic threats no longer shaped daily existence and personal choices. The sunrise that concluded final battle represented both literal dawn and symbolic beginning of era where human civilization could develop without constant threat of supernatural predation that had shaped social structures, individual choices, and collective priorities throughout centuries of hidden warfare between organized demon slayers and creatures whose existence had remained largely unknown to general population, whose protection had been maintained through sacrifice and dedication of warriors whose service had preserved possibility for normal life and conventional concerns about happiness, achievement, and personal fulfillment that peacetime conditions would enable for future generations who would never fully understand cost that had been paid for their security and freedom from supernatural evil that would now exist only in historical memory and cautionary tales about vigilance required for maintaining civilization against forces that could emerge from human weakness and moral failure. The months that followed humanity's triumph over supernatural evil settled over the surviving warriors like gentle rain after violent storms, as three figures who had been forged in the crucible of demonic warfare found themselves learning to exist within peace that their sacrifice had purchased for countless generations yet to come. The cherry blossoms that bloomed outside the rebuilt Kamado household where Zenitsu had chosen to make his home carried fragrance of renewal and hope that replaced the metallic scent of blood and supernatural corruption that had defined their young lives through years of constant vigilance against threats that would never again disturb human civilization's natural development toward prosperity and joy. The boy who had once trembled at every shadow while begging strangers for marriage proposals now rested in sunlight filtering through paper screens, his golden hair catching rays that illuminated transformation more profound than any lightning strike could have achieved through supernatural intervention. In sleep, his breathing had found the rhythm of total concentration, made permanent through dedication, yet carried no tension of anticipated combat, no need for unconscious access to abilities that conscious fear had once prevented him from utilizing when circumstances demanded heroic action beyond normal human capability. Here, in this moment of perfect stillness, we witness the ultimate victory of the human heart over forces that sought to reduce existence to predator and prey, fear and violence. Zenitsu's journey from cowardly boy to legendary demon slayer reminds us that true courage blooms not in the absence of terror, but in the choice to act with compassion despite trembling hands and racing heart. Like thunder that follows lightning, strength often arrives after vulnerability has shown us who we truly are beneath our protective masks. Sleep now, gentle, thunder-blessed dreamer, in the peace that heroes have purchased with their willingness to face the darkness so that others might walk safely in light.